Hello curious people, today I am here to help you. I know you are using this video to help you fall asleep. So before you like this video and subscribe to the channel, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Make yourself comfortable now. I stepped into the stories. I still recall the night vividly, as if it happened just yesterday. It was an ordinary evening, and I had gone to bed at my usual time, expecting a good night's sleep. But little did I know, I was in for a frightening experience that would leave me shaken and searching for answers. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt my body relax and my mind began to unwind. But at some point during the night, I was jolted awake by a sensation that can only be described as terrifying. It felt as if my entire body was being lifted up and then suddenly dropped. The sensation was akin to free falling, but it was happening while I was asleep. The experience was so disorienting that it took me a few moments to realize what was happening. I felt like I was falling rapidly, and my body was completely weightless. It was as if I was floating in midair, with no control over my movements. The sensation was intense, and it left me feeling shaken and disturbed. What made the experience even more unsettling was that it happened twice. Yes, you read that right. My body was lifted up and dropped not once, but twice. The second time was just as intense as the first, and it left me feeling even more disoriented and confused. As I lay in bed, trying to process what had just happened, I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I was trying to make sense of the experience, but my mind was a jumble of questions and fears. What had just happened? Was I dreaming? Was it some kind of sleep disorder? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just a weird dream or a side effect of a sleep disorder. But deep down, I knew that it was something more. The sensation was too real, too intense, and too unsettling to be dismissed as just a dream. As the night wore on, I found it difficult to fall asleep again. My mind was racing, and my body was still reeling from the experience. I was trying to make sense of what had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. The next morning, I woke up feeling shaken and disturbed. The experience had left a lasting impact on me, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. I tried to go about my day as usual, but my mind kept wandering back to the experience. As the days went by, I found myself becoming increasingly obsessed with understanding what had happened. I scoured the internet for answers, reading up on sleep disorders, paranormal experiences, and everything in between. I talked to friends and family, hoping that someone might have some insight into what I had experienced. But the more I searched for answers, the more questions I had. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, and the experience was starting to take a toll on my mental health. It's been a while since the experience, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. I've talked to experts, read up on various theories, and even tried to recreate the experience, although I wouldn't recommend that. But the truth is, I may never know what really happened that night. All I know is that the experience was real, and it's had a lasting impact on me. It's made me more aware of my own mortality, and it's forced me to confront the unknown. It's been a difficult journey, but it's also been a transformative one. As I reflect on the experience, I'm reminded of the mysterious nature of our universe. There are still so many things that we don't understand, and sometimes the most inexplicable experiences can be the most profound. So, if you're reading this and you've had a similar experience, know that you're not alone. There are others out there who have experienced similar things, and there are resources available to help you make sense of it all. And if you're someone who's skeptical of the paranormal or the unexplained, I urge you to keep an open mind. The truth is, there are still many things that we don't understand, and sometimes the most inexplicable experiences can be the most profound. In conclusion, my experience that night was one that I will never forget. It was a frightening and disorienting experience, but it's also been a transformative one. It's forced me to confront the unknown, and it's reminded me of the mysterious nature of our universe. Comment for more stories on PrigWriter.com. Free ride. Why don't you just go to the beach? Carlos' brother shouted, slamming the door. Carlos thought his brother must have gone crazy. Not only did he have no way to get to the beach, he was locked out wearing sweats and a tank top. Carlos had had no desire or intention to be wandering around the streets today. Just standing around in the summer heat felt exhausting. His brother had muscled him out of their tiny apartment in order to get some privacy with his girlfriend. Carlos didn't care what the reason was. No reason was good enough for him to be getting cooked on the sidewalk. With no money in his pockets and few other options, he walked down the boulevard, heading toward the corner market. If the shop was busy, he might be able to steal a drink or some snacks. If not, he could at least relax in the AC till the owner kicked him out. The walk over to the store wasn't far, but there was no shade anywhere to be found. Carlos could feel the sweat pouring off him by the time he reached the parking lot. Unfortunately for him, the parking lot was empty. That wouldn't be a good sign for being able to sneak out a drink or some snacks. At least I can get out of this heat. Carlos walked into the shop, soaking in the blast of cold air that greeted him. His relaxation was short-lived, though. Moving through the store, the owner watched him like a hawk. He slowly wandered down the aisles, enjoying the relief from the sun. Time flew by as he tried to look interested in various items, picking them up and putting them back down on the shelf. The owner got tired watching Carlos finally snapping. "This isn't a hangout, you know. It's a store for paying customers. If you aren't going to buy anything, just get out." "Hey, I was just about to make my purchase. But if this is how you treat your customers, I'm out of here." Yeah, get out of here," the owner said, waving him off with his hand. Carlos backed out of the store, gesturing at the owner. Turning around, he almost ran into a motorcycle parked in the middle of the parking lot. The heat already had him on edge, and with the owner yelling at him, he was ready to explode. He looked around, ready to yell at whoever had left their bike haphazardly in the middle of the parking lot. Only no one was around. The way the bike had been left, he figured the owner couldn't have gone far. Strangely, though, he hadn't noticed anyone else in the store. Waiting for the owner to return, Carlos looked over the bike. The street-style motorcycle looked brand new, freshly painted matte black. The more Carlos looked over the bike, the more jealous and angrier he got. Glancing back around the parking lot, he was surprised that there was still no one in sight. When he looked back down at the bike, he got an even bigger surprise. The keys were dangling from the ignition. Carlos had no idea how he had missed it before. Why not borrow the bike for a little joyride? If the owner really cared about it, he wouldn't have been so careless. Besides, it's not like things don't go missing here all the time. Let's just take it around the block. Swinging his leg over the bike, Carlos settled into the seat. Cautiously, he looked around again, making sure that there was no one in sight. He smiled, turning the key in the ignition, and the motorcycle rumbled to life. Gripping the handles, Carlos revved the bike, shooting off down the boulevard. He didn't have much of a plan other than to catch a breeze before ditching the bike. Speeding down the boulevard, he spotted one of his friends walking by. He slowed down to shout and wave, but realized something was wrong. His hands wouldn't come off the bike. Jerking at his hands, he swerved dangerously around in the lane. No matter how much he fought, his hands stayed locked around the throttle. Carlos let off the throttle, trying to slow the bike to a stop. The bike had a different plan in mind, steadily increasing its speed. Carlos held on for dear life as the bike raced down the streets, getting faster by the second. His heart raced, pounding in his chest. It was all he could do to weave between the cars, narrowly avoiding collisions. Looking ahead, his heart froze. The next traffic light cut over to red. Cars flooded through the intersection, blocking his path. Carlos lowered his head against the bike, closing his eyes and screaming. Horns blared and steel crumbled as cars collided with one another, trying to avoid the motorcycle. A moment later, Carlos opened his eyes, shocked to find himself through the intersection in one piece. Over his shoulder, he could see people starting to climb out of the wreckage, shouting at one another. He also saw a set of red and blue flashing lights. With his face buried in the motorcycle, he hadn't seen the cop waiting at the intersection. Not that he could have stopped the bike. Racing toward the highway, Carlos hoped the cop was too preoccupied with the wreck to pursue him. As he merged onto the highway bridge, a quick glance in his side mirror confirmed he wasn't that lucky. The cop's flashing lights were quickly approaching from behind as he merged onto the bridge. This was quickly becoming his worst nightmare, stuck on the 6-mile stretch of the Franklin Bridge with nowhere to hide. His only option was to try to outrun the cop. The sun gleaming off the ocean water below was blinding as Carlos weaved his way through the traffic. Despite his reckless weaving through traffic, the cop was still closing the distance. A loud voice shouted over the cop's megaphone, "Pull over." Carlos could see the cop car pulling up beside him out of the corner of his eye. All the joy was gone from his brief ride, and he was more than ready to pull over. But his hands were still locked tight to the bike, and it showed no signs of slowing down. He uselessly pulled at the bike throttle, hoping to coax out more speed. To his own surprise, the bike shot forward at an alarming rate, quickly leaving the cop behind. As the bike accelerated, so did the wind blowing into Carlos' face. Bringing his eyes to a squint, he could barely keep them open. A few seconds later, Carlos was forced to shut his eyes completely. The violent rush of air from passing other cars drowned out all the other sounds. It was terrifying white noise filling the time before his inevitable crash. Carlos fought to keep the bike straight, but it started to drift. Panicking, he pulled at the handles to the left, trying to keep his balance, then jerking the bike back to the right. Through frantic adjustments, Carlos lost any sense of where he was on the road. Without warning, the front of the bike lifted up into the air. If Carlos' hands hadn't been locked to the handles, he would have been sent flying off the back. Expecting the bike to rush forward, he clung to the bike with his entire body. Instead, he felt weightless. Forcing his eyes wide open, he saw a massive teal rushing towards him. It took his brain a second to catch up, realizing it was him rushing toward the ocean. The bike had careened over the railing and was hurtling toward the water below. The fall felt like it was ripping Carlos' stomach right out of his body. His mind told him to scream, but there wasn't any time to. Instead, he took a last desperate gasp for air. The bike smashed against the surface, causing an eruption of water. Submerged underwater, he propped his legs on the bike, trying to stand up and rip his arms free. Standing up against the seat, his feet began to sink into the bike. The black body of the bike began to twist and morph in the water. It started to collapse into a large black blob, then stretch out into something new. A long horse's head began to stretch its way out of the blob that Carlos was stuck to. At the same time, 4 long legs started to pull out from the blob, forming the horse's legs. Then the large torso formed, still latching onto Carlos' limbs. The bike's new horse form began to solidify, and it started to kick its legs. The kicking became a gallop, dragging Carlos deep toward the ocean floor. Pressure built up in Carlos's lungs as he struggled to hold his breath. He was quickly running out of time. Pulling himself toward the horse, he opened his mouth wide, letting out a large air bubble. With desperation racing through his mind, he bit down hard on the horse's neck. Reeling from the bit, it spun in a circle, creating a whirlpool underwater. The whirlpool kicked up sand and debris from the ocean floor. Carlos' vision started to darken, looking back towards the surface. The dim glow of the sun was fading away. The last bit of air coughed out from his body, making way for water to flood into his lungs. Feeling his body go limp, the horse finally released him, setting him adrift in the ocean. The death of a graphic designer. So this has been one of the scariest experiences of my life. Perhaps even another example of the butterfly effect. I am a senior graphic designer and recently needed a change within my field. I began studying UX design and applying for positions even as junior just to gain some experience. I came across a post. It was an official job listing for a UX/graphic designer, and it was also not too far from where I live. I applied for the job and maybe 15 others. Within the week, I received 2 interviews, including the listing above. I put on my formal black pencil skirt, white shirt, red heels, and slapped on some stark red lipstick like always. There was a huge sign outside a double-story rundown house. It read EA Designs, It included a professionally designed logo. I don't mind working in a building that looks like a house from the outside, but as I got inside, it looked like an unkept old age home. There was even a dark playroom on the right as you entered. It had a ball pit and some other kids' facilities, but there was no light except for the light from the passage and the open front door. A middle-aged Caucasian lady appeared before me. She asked, "Are you Zed?" I slightly nodded yes, not moving or blinking as she closed the door behind me. Still skeptic of my surroundings, I quickly snapped out of it and pulled out my hand. "Yes, it's nice to meet you," I said confidently. She said, "Right this way. The office is at the back." I followed slowly, gleaming through each room as we passed. It was mostly empty rooms, just rusted walls, and no visible windows or air. It smelled dusty. My spider senses were on overdrive, but the dumb knave me continued along the passage. At the back was a medium to small-sized room. There was a huge, almost office/dining room looking table in the center. At the left-hand corner, there was an elderly lady writing on some paper. She did not even raise her head to look at me, and sitting not too far from her was a young Caucasian girl who seemed to be in her early 20s with long blonde hair. "Oh hey, you must be Zed," she said in a cheerful voice. I smiled politely and responded, "Yes, and you are?" "Sam, web developer. Yeesh," she exclaimed. "I know this place looks like a dump, but we don't get walk-in clients as we mainly offer an online service, and we just moved here, so hopefully we will be doing some interior design soon." Her words put me at ease, and I felt like a jerk for being judgmental, although it was quite an unprofessional setting, and the table was filled with papers in stacks, almost covering the entire table, which again, I might add, is huge. The interview proceeded as usual, and the next day they called to say I had gotten a position. The package was quite impressive too. I mean, it was a lot of money being offered, but I didn't think too much of it because there are some senior designers in the field that earn that well. I accepted, perhaps because of the large offer, but also because it didn't seem all that bad after the interview. I was to start the following day, which was a Wednesday. I got there early and was greeted by the same middle-aged lady. At the back, Sam had been waiting for me. She pulled up a chair next to her. The table was still covered in papers, and there was not a single spot for me to sit my laptop down. I sat there quietly for about a few moments. I had suddenly seen something running across the room. It was probably a rat. I jumped to my feet, knocking down a stack of papers at the edge of the table. The table became visible, exposing a section filled with holes, scratches, and what looked like dried blood. Blood rushed down to my feet, and my heart almost fell out of my mouth as I began having an internal attack. I said, "Oh no, was that a rat? I hate rats. I have some rat poison in my car. I'll be right back." I left my laptop behind and walked as if nothing was wrong. As soon as I reached my car, I booked it. I didn't even blink or look back. I sped back home. I contemplated going back for my laptop and just quitting officially, but something in me didn't even want to move off the couch I had been seated in for almost 2 hours. A few days later, there was a spur of outroar on the news. A body of a young boy in his 20s had been found in an abandoned house. He was identified, and images of him were being displayed on the news. The house he had been found at had flashed on the screen. It was the same house. I felt queasy and lightheaded. I remembered having left my laptop there and thought the police might suspect me, but no evidence was found at the site. I tried to find him on Facebook and Google. I finally found him online and read through his profile. My fingers finally stopped scrolling when I read "studied graphic design." Had it not been for the rat, I would not have knocked over the papers left, and the graphic designer on the news would have definitely been me. My friend's ghost is haunting me. He's not dead. Thomas offed himself in a most unusual fashion. It is an unspoken truth, and for good reason, but one I feel is necessary to point out. It could have something to do with what's happening. Of course, his unusual manner of death is not the only unspoken truth. Another is the fact that he died at all. As the story goes, He was found in his contraption. That's what they're calling it now, just in the nick of time, and is in a coma for the foreseeable future, but is very much alive. Apparently removing him from that mass of centipede sculptures and snake pretzels in what his note/manifesto called the dollhouse was such an intense procedure it required the removal of limbs and left multiple first responders catatonic. I'm not supposed to know any of that, but I did some digging. This is all very hard for me to write about, so excuse me if I come across a bit cold. I love him, and it's been a challenging few months. I admit he was suffering so horribly that there was a certain cold relief when he was finally free. That relief is gone now. The leaves had just started to change when I first noticed something different in the air. He had been hospitalized for a week then. Thomas was a person who always had a very distinct feel, if that makes sense. One of those people who scratches an itch that no one else can scratch. Even at the height of his episodes and whatnot, there was a sense of safety and security in being around him that's hard to explain. Like the universe consists of only the two of you, that feeling takes on a different tone entirely when you're taking the shortcut through the cold, dark woods at the end of a long night shift, and you feel yourself drowning in it. I could have sworn he was there with me. He had me checking behind trees, even looking up into the stars. Anywhere he could be hiding. Did he get out early? Was he surprising me? I found nothing that night, and that feeling has not left since. It has evolved, however. I can tell it's him, but he feels different. I'm scared, and I'm scared for him. I did find something a week or so after that. I was reading a book alone in my apartment. I was feeling sad and nostalgic that night, and had dug up my old copy of Where the Wild Things Are. It's a good comfort read in a time like this. But I turned the page and saw a picture I don't remember being in the book. Max was looking right at me, ignoring the monsters around him. And the words simply said, "The doctors lied." I stared at this for several seconds. I was going crazy. I didn't know what to make of it. When I turned the page again, it was the same image, but closer to his face, and he had almost a mournful expression. And the words were, "It worked." What worked? What are they lying about? The rest of the book was like usual, and I could not find those pages again. Another month of his coma. Another month of getting used to not having any friends, other than that feeling in the air. Of course, I was driving home for Thanksgiving, listening to an audiobook. I'll admit it was an old Goosebumps book, the first dummy one. Sad and nostalgic again. Holidays, all that. I had been zoning out in the desert void of the highway when the woman reading the book said, "I am alive and dead." She said that with great emphasis, and stopped reading for several seconds. Then, the experiments continue. Past where I took them. They won't stop. They won't let. And she abruptly switched gears and continued to read the book. Rewinding did not find anything, and there was a lot of fighting with my family that week. My therapist thinks I'm just having trouble processing my grief. What I'm really having trouble with is trusting doctors. All day today, I've been thinking about his dollhouse. No one told me anything about it. My digging has only led to certain keywords and phrases, but some twisted part of my mind wishes it was me that was found in that contraption, whatever it was. I hate that he did that. I don't blame him, and I understand, and I hate it. Through most of my typing this, some voice has been screaming in my head, "Build your own dollhouse. Build your own dollhouse." That's just a psychological thing. I've learned how to tell the difference. They won't let me go. They won't let me pass on. The arms are clawing out for me, clawing out for my soul, clawing out to grab me and pull me free. But the doctors won't let me. The doctors will only hold me here. The doctors have me alive and dead at once, and they will not stop the experiment. The experiment I thought was mine is theirs. They will not stop. The arms are clawing out to me, and the voices are screeching for me, screeching my name. And the experiment will never stop. Sorry, I was dozing off. I'll leave that paragraph. I think Thomas wrote that. To think he went to such lengths to escape his suffering. only for these lying doctors to drag it on, to drag on his suffering forever. I guess it's my turn to carry the lantern again. So I found a lantern on my front porch this morning. At first, I hoped it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a neighbor's delivery left at the wrong door. But the longer I stared at it, the more I couldn't kid myself. I knew what it was. It was exactly the same as I remembered. Large and heavy, made of black iron, its glass panels smudged black. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a prank. But that thought faded as quickly as it came. What kind of prank would this be? What was the punchline? The more I looked, the harder it was to breathe. It wasn't just a lantern. It was the lantern. The one I've tried so hard to forget. I haven't touched it. I don't even know what to do. Call the police. Sure. And what would I say? Hi, officer. There's a haunted lantern on my porch. Can you come pick it up? No. I thought I'd moved past this. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. Just a trick my mind played to explain something I was too young to understand. But seeing it here, solid and real, has unraveled years of therapy in an instant. I don't know who else to ask for help. Maybe someone out there has been through something like this before. Please, if you have, let me know. Because all I can think about are the silent streets of Lister Lane, the locked doors, the lantern, and the night it was my turn to carry it. The neighborhood was always unnervingly quiet on lantern nights. No cars on the streets, no dogs barking, not even the chirp of crickets. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic footsteps of the lantern keeper echoing through the stillness. People locked their doors and drew their curtains long before sunset, shutting out the night as if it were something to be feared. I used to sneak to my bedroom window, pressing my face against the glass and peeking through the blinds, just to catch a glimpse of the flickering flame. It was beautiful, in a strange way. The warm, golden light swayed gently with each step. I thought it was mesmerizing. My parents, however, hated when I watched. You shouldn't stare, my mom would say, her voice tight and hurried. No one ever explained why. I wasn't told much about the lantern walk, other than the rules. The lantern must be walked once every week, and never by the same person twice in a row. The lantern must be carried at a steady pace, from one end of the street to the other. The walk cannot begin until at least 1 hour after sunset. Under no circumstances can the lantern keeper look behind them before the walk is complete. Whenever I asked for more, for the who, the what, the why, my mom would cut me off. It's tradition, she'd say. You'll understand when you're older. Yeah, that never happened. I remember how nervous my parents always seemed the night before their turn. My dad would pace the house relentlessly, his footsteps heavy and uneven, like he was walking out his fear. If I tried to ask him a question, he'd wave me off or grunt, his mind too preoccupied to form an answer. My mom was different. She'd sit by the window, still as a statue, staring out at the street like she was waiting for something, or maybe watching for something. Mom, I'd say, but her replies were distant, distracted. Yes, sweetheart. She wasn't really listening. She wasn't really there. It always made me uneasy, watching them like that. Two people I relied on so much suddenly turning into strangers for the night. I became pretty independent at a young age. On lantern nights and the nights before, I learned to take care of myself, making my own dinner, running my own bath, and tucking myself into bed. When my little sister, Danny, was born, I started looking after her too. I was only 8, but on those nights, it felt like I was the only adult in the house. Even when she was a baby, I'd hold her, feed her, and rock her to sleep while my parents stayed locked in their quiet tension. I know what you might be thinking. How could they leave that much responsibility on a child? But it wasn't like that the rest of the time. My mom was an amazing cook, always surprising us with homemade meals and treats. My dad took me bowling nearly every weekend, always joking that I'd beat him someday. They loved us deeply. But when lantern night came around, it was like the weight of it crushed everything else. No matter how much they cared, No matter how strong they were, it broke through. When I turned 13, it was my turn. That evening, just after sunset, there was a quiet knock at the door. No one answered it. My dad didn't even flinch. My mom stayed by the window, as still as she'd been all day. So, I opened it. And there it was, the lantern. It was larger up close and heavier than I expected when I picked it up. Its iron frame cool against my skin. The intricate filigree dug into my palms, making it hard to hold. The glass panels streaked with black mold. My dad appeared beside me, resting a shaky hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything, just gave me a quick squeeze before stepping away. My mom followed. She grabbed my arm, her fingers cold, and whispered, "Don't look back." Her voice was soft but urgent, trembling with something I couldn't name. "No matter what," she added. Then she let me go. I stepped out into the night. Thankfully, we lived near the entrance to the street. I didn't have far to go to reach the starting point. I got to the entrance and, gripping the lantern tightly, started counting houses. Lister Lane was empty. Not just quiet, but empty. It felt wrong, like the air had been sucked out of the street. The houses looked different in the lantern's glow, bigger, darker, their edges blurring into shadows that seemed to stretch and ripple. For some reason, the street lamps never worked on lantern nights. They were just tall, dark silhouettes, looming like sentinels. The only light came from a few faintly glowing windows and the lantern itself. The flame flickered softly, its warm glow steady against the chill in the air. I kept walking, my footsteps the only sound. I'd made it halfway, and honestly, it wasn't that scary. I knew this street like the back of my hand. Every adult had been a lantern keeper before me, and they always seemed fine afterward. Tired, maybe, but fine. There had never been a struggle, a scream, or even a whisper of something going wrong. I told myself it was just another chore, like taking out the trash. I glanced at the flame, its warm glow steady and soothing, and before I realized it, a faint smile crept onto my face. It wasn't so bad. In fact, it was kind of nice. There was something surreal about actually holding the light I used to sneak glimpses of every week. It felt like I was part of something bigger, a tradition I'd watched but never really understood. For a moment, I forgot the rules, the tension, the unease I'd seen in my parents. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. But then I heard it. A voice, soft and trembling, cutting through the stillness. It was my sister, Danny. She was calling my name. I froze. Her voice sounded so small, so scared. My heart jumped to my throat. How had she managed to sneak out? My first instinct was to turn around, to make sure she was okay. But then I remembered the rule. "Get back inside, Danny," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "You know you shouldn't be out here." She whimpered softly, the kind of sound she used to make when she was hurt or frightened. I sighed. Traditions be damned. I wasn't going to leave her outside in the middle of the night. I was already bracing myself to turn, ready to tell her off and walk her back home, when I felt it. Her arms wrapped around my waist from behind, trembling violently. I looked, she whispered, her voice breaking like glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as her words sank in. I looked back, she repeated, and then the sobs came. Frantic, desperate, choking sobs. Her grip tightened, like she was holding on for dear life. "Please," she begged, her voice raw. "Take me home." We were still only halfway down the street, and I hadn't looked back. I gripped the lantern tightly in one arm, shifting it to free the other. Without turning, I reached back toward her. "Hold my hand," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "We'll finish together." She didn't respond, but I felt her cold, trembling fingers slip into mine. Her grip was weak at first, but it tightened quickly, as if she was afraid to let go as she cried into my back. The walk felt so much longer with Danny in tow. Her feet shuffled behind me, clumsy and uneven. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, trying not to sound scared. She didn't answer. Instead, she squeezed my hand tighter, her grip cold and desperate. I felt her other hand clutch the back of my shirt, her fingers trembling as she buried her face against me. Her sobs didn't stop. If anything, they grew quieter but heavier, like she was trying to hold them back. She stumbled behind me, her feet catching on mine every few steps, nearly tripping me more than once. "Danny," I whispered, glancing down at the lantern's flickering glow. "We're almost there. Just hold on." Her cries began to fade, softening into quiet whimpers, each one growing weaker and weaker. By the time we neared the end of the street, there was nothing. No sound, no cold, no small presence clutching at my back, the small hand in mine. I froze, gripping the lantern tightly as my heart pounded in my chest. "Danny," I whispered, looking down. She was gone. I panicked. I had just felt her hand in mine. She had been right there. My heart raced as I spun around instinctively, desperate to see where she had gone. It was only for a second, and the lantern's flame went out. The street plunged into darkness, and the faint, warm glow from the neighbors' windows vanished with it, like someone had snuffed out the entire world. The silence was absolute, pressing down on me like a weight. Then came footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. Each one echoed in the stillness, sending a chill straight through me. They quickened. The sound grew louder, closer, faster, sprinting toward me at a speed that didn't sound human. I screamed, shut my eyes, and froze in place. My whole body trembled, every nerve on fire, waiting for the impact of whatever was coming. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving only an empty, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching the dark lantern in my trembling hands, too terrified to move. Nobody came to check on the blood-curdling scream I made. Not a single door opened, not a single curtain shifted. The street remained silent, still, like nothing had happened. I called out for Danny, but there was no response, no sign of her. I searched for her, but she was nowhere to be found. The street felt endless, stretching farther with every step I took, the darkness pressing in around me. Eventually, I gave up. I made it home, dropping the lantern carefully on the front porch. My legs were shaking, my hands numb, but its weight still lingered in my palms, like I could still feel the cold iron digging into my skin. When I stepped through the door, my family was waiting in the kitchen, but something about their faces made me stop cold. Danny was sitting at the table, staring down at her hands. Her shoulders were hunched, and she looked so small, so fragile. "Danny," I whispered. She flinched at the sound of my voice, her head snapping up briefly before she bolted from the room and ran upstairs. I turned to my dad, but he wouldn't look at me. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the far wall, like he hadn't noticed I'd even come in. My mom didn't say anything either. She just stood there, arms folded, her face pale and drawn. "Mom." I tried. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. Over the next few weeks, it only got worse. My parents barely spoke to me, avoiding me like I wasn't even there. Danny refused to be alone in a room with me, her wide, frightened eyes darting away whenever I tried to talk to her. It was like I'd become a stranger in my own house, like they didn't even recognize me anymore. Meals were never plated up for me again, and bowling nights became a distant memory. By the time I turned 18, not much had changed. The distance between me and my family had grown into a chasm I couldn't cross. Conversations were clipped, interactions tense, and Danny still refused to be anywhere near me. It wasn't just avoidance anymore. It felt like fear. It was like my family had disowned me without saying the words out loud. They never acknowledged what happened that night, and I was never given the lantern again. I moved out of state as soon as I could, desperate to leave it all behind. Eventually, I started a family of my own. We settled in a quiet suburb, far from Lister Lane. It's the kind of neighborhood where kids ride bikes on the sidewalk and porch lights stay on all night. We've built a nice life for ourselves. Now, the lantern is sitting on my porch. This morning, I decided to call my parents. I don't know what I was expecting, but to my surprise, my mom picked up after only a few rings. Her voice was bright and warm, not at all the surprised tone of a woman that hadn't heard from her daughter in 14 years. "Hello, honey. What's got you calling this early?" I hesitated. Hey, Mom. I had some questions about the lantern." She cut me off with a soft, bemused laugh. "Lantern? What lantern?" "The one the neighborhood carried through the street every week," I said, gripping the phone tighter. There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought maybe she understood. But when she spoke again, her voice was calm and dismissive. "Sweetie, are you feeling all right? Have you been eating properly? We're making a roast this Sunday. You're always welcome if you can make it down." I hung up without saying another word. An unknown number called me about 20 minutes later. I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I answered. "Sis, why'd you hang up on Mom? Are you okay?" It was Danny. Her voice was bubbly, bright, concerned but casual, like we'd just spoken yesterday. But it was strange. She sounded the same, but different. I haven't heard her voice since she was 10, since the day I left. It was like hearing a stranger wearing my sister's tone, her inflection, her laugh. I stammered, struggling to find the words. "Do you remember the lantern?" She paused, then let out a soft scoff, followed by a confused laugh. "What are you talking about? You can't be serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Honestly, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you okay? You're scaring me a little. I can drive down if you want." I hung up. Her voice had been calm, warm, completely unaffected, just like Mom's. And then there was Dad's voicemail, which arrived not long after. It was short and cheerful, as though nothing had ever happened. "Hey, kiddo. Heard you talked to Mom and Danny today. Just checking in. Let me know if you want to go bowling next time you're in town." It was all wrong. So wrong. Now I'm sitting here, staring at the lantern on my porch. The flame is lit. Its glow steady but faint, casting long shadows that dance against the patio. My phone sits beside me, vibrating every few minutes with another voicemail. My mom, my dad, even Danny. They're all worried now. I haven't listened to them. I can't. Because I hear it again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They hid in the graves. I don't know what you will think about me at the end, but I need to get this off my chest. My therapist would never believe me. If he did, he would be the one needing therapy. You people here might be the only ones crazy enough to not laugh me out of the room. So, here goes nothing. Before I start, I should explain a few things, so the reason we were there to begin with makes more sense. I'm from Germany. Once you've reached the last grades, you have to make a sort of special assignment. To put it in a nutshell, you have to work together with a few other students over the span of roughly a year on a project of your choosing. Think of it as a dumbed-down version of a bachelor thesis, something a bunch of dipshits in their late teens can manage. I and 3 friends decided to work together, but we had no idea what subject to choose from. You see, every project needs a practical part, something that isn't just you writing about your topic. You must go out there and do something. Sounds vague, right? Exactly. Knew we were going insane until my best friend, Jonathan, had an idea. His neighbor's job was to keep an eye on the forests in the region, checking whether everything was fine and dandy. He also hunted as a hobby. He was the kind of guy who knew far too much about something and would bore you with every detail, but he was also a very nice guy. When Jonathan was talking to him one day, his neighbor suggested picking a nearby forest and its wildlife as a topic. He had a lot of data on the forests, which would make the writing part of our assignment straightforward. We all liked the idea, but the icing on top was the practical part. We could set up a few marking spots that would attract some animals. Perhaps you have seen some of them before. Imagine scratching pads attached to a tree that animals would love to rub against, leaving behind fur and other stuff. It was a done deal from the get-go, as it didn't require any greater work from us. The neighbor just gave us everything. This leads us to the day that destroyed my life. Not gonna lie, I am a bit nervous writing about it, but I think it is for the better to get it out of my system. In retrospective, it kills me how easily we could have avoided it all if we hadn't been so fucking lazy. Because the project was so easy to pull off, we didn't do shit for months. There was no reason to stress ourselves, so we rather went to parties or played video games. But once it was clear that we couldn't ignore it anymore, we went out into the forest to set our animal traps. In the middle of December. Sounds stupid, right? It gets even dumber because we decided to set them up during the foggiest day you could imagine. You might wonder why we would do something like this. When I said we did until the last moment, I meant it. You have to understand. We really didn't want to do it. So the absolute last time when we had to start was a Saturday afternoon. But to our defense, I can't remember the last cold winter with a lot of snow. In our region at last. So when Jonathan drove us to the forest, there wasn't much white outside. I already mentioned Jonathan. I have known him since we were children. He was a good guy. The kind of guy who didn't say anything when he was the only person in his friend group to get a driver's license and had to serve as the personal taxi. Even at parties, he never complained that he couldn't drink because he had to drive. Though he never liked to drink. He hated not being in control over himself. Besides Jonathan and me, 2 other friends accompanied us, Peter and Marie. I don't like writing too much about my dead friends, as it fucks with my head. But I think you guys should know at least a little bit about them. Peter was the opposite of Jonathan. Very extroverted, loud, chaotic, and a bit eccentric. Not in the weirdo way. He was a bit unhinged, but in an endearing way. Mary was a bit of a tomboy. She didn't really fit in with the other girls and liked to hang around us guys. While she sometimes gave not like other girls vibes, she had no ego. She was quite goth and had a hang for older places that are long abandoned. I had thought she was just too into horror stories, but she explained it to me as having ruin and lust. You can Google if you want. Sorry for yapping, but I think that's all the context you need to know. As I have already mentioned, my friends and I were driving into a forest to place our traps, if you can call them that. The drive there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The usual bicker and jokes you yourselves have heard and said hundreds of times. Jonathan kept his mouth shut and his eyes on the road. While the street wasn't frozen over, and he had taken this road countless times, he didn't risk anything. Peter liked to fuck with him for that, daring him to accelerate a little bit. Thankfully, Jonathan wasn't someone you could easily steer in any direction. If Peter proved himself persistent enough, though, he earned himself 1 or 2 middle fingers from Jonathan. Mary and I went over where to best put out traps as Jonathan took a dirt road into the forest. We couldn't drive too deep into the forest as the road narrowed down, making it impossible for a car to pass through. Usually, parking your car in the middle of the forest path was forbidden, but we didn't expect anyone at a time like this to show up. But it took a bit of convincing for Jonathan, who wasn't thrilled by the idea. But what if someone wants to pass? He asked. They would. Jonathan, please, Peter said, getting the traps out of the trunk. You're not the fucking Pope, okay? Nothing is gonna happen. Just calm down. Jonathan frowned, but he stopped arguing. I helped Peter carrying the traps and equipment to attach them to trees, while Jonathan and Marie smoked, watching us struggle. As Marie would be responsible for positing the traps in the right spot and Jonathan had driven us here, Peter and I were assigned to carry the damn things around. Despite both of us having agreed to it beforehand, Peter and I bitched and moaned the entire time, Jonathan grinning with a cigarette in his hand. You know, it never made sense to me why Jonathan started smoking. For Marie, it fit perfectly. She already drank black coffee and loved the bleakness of life and all that. Smoking gave her the final edge. Would have been weird if she didn't. But Jonathan was always concerned about his health to a certain degree. Like I said, he never drank alcohol, but he also never did anything foolish that would put him at risk. Perhaps he smoked to look cooler. Or perhaps it was because both his parents smoked. I don't know. I never asked, and now I will never know. I'm gonna skip a bit forward. You probably aren't interested in how we determined where to put the traps and how we had to do it. No, that's not why you're here. Though one detail I want to mention is how silent it was. I have never been much of a forest guy, but I thought there should be some sounds, right? Of course, during winter there shouldn't be much going on, but you would expect to see and hear some noise coming from an animal. But there was nothing. After setting up a few scratch pads, Marie clapped against my shoulder. "Look at this," she said, pointing at the ground. She wiped away dirt and snow with her foot to reveal parts of a stone path in front of us. We both kneeled to have a better look. Most of it was still covered in a thin layer of snow, but we could make out most of it. The stones that were used were old, battered by time, the gaps between them filled with whatever plant life could endure the winter. I'm not an expert, but even I could clearly see that whoever had worked on the stones had done so with crude tools. This wasn't the result of someone from the last decades or centuries. That pathway was ancient. Marie's face lit up, a crooked smile spreading over her features. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. All she needed to do was to look at me. I sighed. "Do we have to? I want to go home." "Come on," she said. "This leads somewhere. Let's just take a look. A quick one." I had mentioned it before. Marie had a big knack for ruins. She got a thrill of sorts seeing them. In particular, the ones that look really shady, like they haven't been cared for in years. They had to look like they were about to fall apart any minute to hit the right spot for Marie. Don't ask why. She once tried to describe it to me. "You are engulfed in a deep, profound melancholy," she had said. Thereafter, I never asked again. "What is it?" Peter asked, walking over to us. Mary just pointed at the stone path. Peter grinned, nodding. "Ah, I see," he said. "We can have a glimpse." "Oi, Jonathan," Peter called to him. "Come, we've got something to check out." Jonathan frowned, his expression deepening as he saw the stone path. "Okay, sure, but no more than 5 minutes. I'm freezing." Peter rolled his eyes, about to call him weak, but before he could, Marie hurried ahead, following the path. I kept my hands in my pockets, kicking away some snow as we followed her. She didn't run off like a dog, but she walked with a quick pace. Peter caught up to her in no time. As soon as someone nearby showed excitement, it spread to him, making him act like an overly excited kid. If whatever caused the excitement turned out to be boring to him, Peter would quickly lose his newfound energy and become lethargic. This never happened with Marie, though, as she was also into spooky things. Jonathan sighed, massaging his temples. I clapped him on the shoulder and gave him a little shake. "Hey, maybe we'll find something cool." "Come on, man." "Sure, whatever," he said. "But don't bring any junk into my car like last time." "You will." "Yeah, I'll check them. Especially Peter, I know. Now come on. Let's hurry before we lose them." Jonathan grimaced, a response on his lips but lacking the energy to speak it. "Fine," he muttered. Jonathan had always looked a bit tired. Besides Marie, he was the only one my age who drank coffee voluntarily. I swear, he was one of those people who made a big deal if they hadn't had their morning coffee. He made too many horrible jokes about dying without his daily caffeine fix. Marie mentioned a collapsed windmill she had once visited with her brother as Jonathan, and I caught up with her and Peter. Before Peter could make an intelligent remark about the ruined state after fireworks hit it, I saw the destination the stone path led to through the trees. The fog kept much of it hidden, but I could tell it was a building covered in snow. Even though I didn't get a clear look at it, I knew exactly what it was. A church. "Hey, Marie," I said, pointing at it. Marie had cut Peter off before he had the chance to make a joke about the windmill. As she turned around, her eyes lit up, sparkling in sharp contrast to her black makeup. Oh, hell yes. Seeing a church in the middle of the forest, seemingly abandoned, now she ran off like a dog. What did I expect? I muttered under my breath, hurrying after her. Peter sprinted past me, echoing Marie's curse with his own. Jonathan kept a sluggish jog behind me, while Peter searched for any excuse to move. Jonathan hated sudden movements. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the fog made it hard to get a clear view of the church until we stood in front of it. It was small, barely big enough for a dozen people. Its tower was the most impressive part, mainly because of the unimpressive building it was attached to. Parts of the church's roof had collapsed, and the windows were all smashed. Snow covered the entire thing, giving it a certain atmosphere that didn't scream ancient ruin. "Oh my God, this is so metal," Marie said. As she was about to reach it, she stopped suddenly. Peter nearly collided with her. "Mary, what the," he said, then fell silent. "What the hell?" Marie whispered. Because of the fog, Jonathan and I could only see them once we reached Marie and Peter. In front of the church stood 6 statues, lined up leading toward the entrance. They stood in pairs, facing each other, the gap between them forming the path you were supposed to take to get into the church. You might think they were meant to guard the entrance, which would be strange for a church, but their appearance didn't suggest guards to me. At first, they appeared to be made of stone, but when we wiped away the snow, we discovered they were made of ice. They looked human but had dreadful expressions, as if they were about to be torn apart. The details on their faces were insane. So insane that even Marie and Peter kept their distance. Touching them to reveal their faces was as far as any of us wanted to go with those statues. Marie laughed nervously, failing to hide the tremble in her voice. "Wow, that's heavy. That's freaky." "Aha," Jonathan said. "You could say that." "Oh, Dan," Peter said. "Look at this." Peter pointed at the fields around the church. Again, thanks to the fog, not much was visible. Moreover, the fields Peter meant were behind the church, making them even harder to spot while walking toward it. But as we took a step forward, gravestones became visible, emerging from the fog. The statues alone were unsettling, but stepping into a graveyard in the middle of the forest really made my skin crawl. "That's a bit," I said. "That's a bit much, right?" Marie tried to regain her excitement, kneeling in front of one of the graves, clearing the gravestone to read the name. She squinted, but the writing had been weathered away, leaving only fragments that were impossible to decipher. Peter kicked a different gravestone, hands in his pockets, shaking off the snow. He gave it a few tries, but couldn't read a single letter of what had once been carved into the stone. The gravestones looked worse than they should have. I have no idea how a gravestone should look after a couple hundred years of fighting the elements, but large sections were missing, as if someone had broken them off. Maybe they had crumbled away naturally, or maybe someone had accelerated the process. "Okay," Jonathan said. "That was something. How about we go home now?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm getting bad vibes. Let's head out." "You guys are wimps," Peter said, keeping his face turned away from us while stomping on the gravestone. Despite his best efforts, even he couldn't hide the fact that he had paled. Let's go inside the church," Jonathan groaned. "Peter, please." "Grow a pair, Jonathan," Peter replied. "Mary, you're in, right?" Mary stood up, a frown carved into her features. She massaged her lower jaw, seeming puzzled by the whole ordeal. Sure. I want to take a closer look." Peter looked at me. He said nothing, only raised an eyebrow. I hated when he called me a wimp. "Fine. Only for a few seconds. I want to get out of this forest as fast as possible." Jonathan sighed, deciding against his better judgment to come along with the rest of the group. The gate to the church was half open. The gap wasn't big enough for any of us to get through. It took all 4 of us to push it wide enough, the hinges creaking as they moved for the first time in who knows how long. To no one's surprise, the inside of the church was nothing special. Most of it was shrouded in darkness, with the only light coming through the broken windows and collapsed roof. The parts that were illuminated revealed several beer bottles shattered on the ground, with an old fireplace in the center of the church. Seeing this, a few things made more sense. Some kids our age must have found the place before us and decided to drink here. They made a bonfire, and while drunk, started destroying the place. They smashed the windows and probably used a baseball bat or something like it on the graves. Murray seemed to have come to the same conclusion, grimacing. Assholes. Way to ruin the place. Peter smiled. Pun intended. Murray stared at him, eyes narrowing. What? Screw you. Peter shrugged, stepping in front of the abandoned bonfire, nudging some beer bottles with his feet. He tried so hard to play it cool, but it was clear as day that he hated stepping further into the church. I never understood why he always wanted to impress us. Maybe he didn't. Maybe the only person he wanted to impress was Marie. That place is, Peter mumbled to himself, looking around. As his eyes landed on the back of the church, the darkest corner, he jumped back, screaming, Jesus Christ. He yelled, nearly falling into the broken beer bottles and bonfire. Wow, Peter, I said, catching him as he bumped into me. Jonathan took his phone out, turned its light on, and pointed at the back of the church. I wish he hadn't. Leaning against the crumbling wall was a massive crucifix with a woman nailed to it. There was no snow on her, thanks to the still intact parts of the roof protecting her from it. She looked just like the statues outside. At first glance, she appeared to have been made from stone, but due to her surface reflecting the light back, it was obvious she was crafted from ice. Unlike her counterparts outside, we could see her entire figure. There were semblances of clothing carved into the statue, but nothing more, lurking out of the thick layer of ice. Whoever had made her seemed satisfied by capturing nothing but her general form, though they have failed somewhat at that. Besides her face, everything seemed too big. The proportion of the body was off compared to the head of the statue. Before I knew it, I had taken a few steps towards the statue. There was something weird about the crucifix. It wasn't part of the statue. That was a real wooden crucifix made to crucify people. It was in a horrible condition, the wood ripped and rotten. Only by some miracle did it bear the weight of the figure it carried. Furthermore, the crucifix was too big for the statue. I mean, it looked like it was made for someone a few feet taller. And the statue was our height already. That thing could have buried you with ease. The face, Marie said, stepping beside me. She was right. It was normal looking. Perhaps normal isn't the right word, but considering the circumstances, it appeared shockingly plain. No grimace of pain or horror like the statues outside. She looked calm, her eyes directed to the ground. But something was off. Something about her expression didn't seem genuine. As if the crafter had failed in capturing the minute details in the human face. Or as if the statue faked it. What I mean is when someone acts like they are calm, like nothing bothers them right now. The statue appeared as if there were hidden emotions boiling underneath the surface. If this was intended, then the craftsman was a true master of his craft. But this wouldn't make much sense either. Why spend so much time and effort on the face and then entirely ignore the body? Okay, Jonathan said, that's too much. Let's head out and act like this never happened. But Jonathan, Peter begun. I will hear none of it. Jonathan. Peter, look at this. I don't want to know why it's here, or who made it. Fuck, this person could stumble in here any moment, and I don't want to be anywhere near that psycho. Peter opened his mouth, but he had nothing to respond with. His bravado had burned away by discovering the statue. Marie and I were standing right in front of it. She was about to touch it as Jonathan turned off his lightning. Guys, I swear to God, if you're not coming right now, I will leave you here. We both turned towards him. There was no point in denying the truth. Finding this little church with its weird statues was the most exciting and frightening thing we had ever experienced. But this place was wrong. None of this made any sense. This was where it got its allure from, but we were playing with fire. Marie nodded. You're right, Jonathan. We shouldn't. A groan cut through Marie's words and made her stop. The sound came from the crucifix. 2 seconds. None of us moved or talked for 2 seconds, but my God, did it feel longer than that. The act of turning around made my entire body cramp up, every muscle tense. There was nothing. Nothing about the statue or crucifix had changed. Nothing had appeared out of thin air. I exchanged glances with Marie. Perhaps something was behind the crucifix, and whatever had made that sound didn't appear to be good health. It sounded more like the last breath of someone or something dying. I plucked out my pocket knife, touched the crucifix, and glimpsed to what lay behind it. Marie used her phone to spend light, so we could see what was hiding behind it. And again, nothing. Only debris. As we both had our hands on the rotten wood of the crucifix, the entire thing fell forward. I let out a gasp of air, too surprised to even scream, and leaped out of the way. Marie did the same as the crucifix collapsed onto the ground, shattering the statue into countless pieces, covered in the broken piece of what would have taken hours to make. The church's silence carried the slam throughout the building into the forest, its echo hanging heavy on all of us. As I locked eyes with Marie, I knew she had felt it too. We both had our hands on the thing. The crucifix hadn't just fallen forward out of nowhere. Something had pushed it. We both jumped onto our legs and dashed towards our friends, the ice shards crunching underneath our feet. Marie jerked her light up, searching for whatever had shoved the crucifix. But there was nothing. Whoever was responsible would have been behind the top of the cross, somehow attached to the wall and small enough to fit into the gap between wood and wall. Did you see it? Marie asked. Mary, fuck, are you all right? Peter said. Did you see something behind it? Something pushing it? Jonathan came towards her, putting a hand on her shoulder. Mary, you need to breathe. Did you? No, we saw nothing. Okay, just breathe, and then you can tell us what just happened. She's right, I said. There was something. Something pushed it. Fuck, there was something. What? Peter said, his eyes racing from Marie to me, looking for hints of a joke. What are you talking about? The thing made a sound. You took a closer look, and then it just fell. I shook my head, having my hand on my chest, trying and failing to calm my heart. No, that's not. We didn't see anything, Jonathan said. But whatever caused it doesn't matter. We have to go now. Marie nodded, already at the exit. She still pointed at the crucifix and the shattered statue, but said nothing. Repeating herself wouldn't make any difference. As she walked outside backwards, a growl sounded from behind her. 3 wild dogs stood between the statues, baring their fangs. Neither of them seemed to be in healthy condition. They were very thin. So thin you could see their rib cage underneath their skin, their fur missing at several spots. Scars covered their bodies. Parts of their ears had been ripped off, marking of teeth still visible. They would have been a sorry bunch if they weren't drooling as they stared at Marie, their hunger radiating out of their eyes. Marie gasped once, and then they rushed her. She made it back into the church before one of them caught up to her. The dog dug its fangs into her right calf, tearing at her with reckless abandonment. I can still hear her first scream. Faster than I could register, Peter had grabbed 2 broken beer bottles and leaped towards in front of Marie, dashing in between her and the 2 other dogs. While he roared at them, slashing one of them across its snout, keeping them at bay, Jonathan and I came to Marie's aid. The dog shook her leg, trying to rip her flesh away. Hearing her pained screams, we both stomped down on the dog's head and neck. You know, I always thought I was someone that could never harm an animal. But at that moment, I wanted to see this waste of air whine and cry as we turn it into a bloody mess. The dog was already weakened, and I could see how it withstood our kicks out of sheer desperation. At first, I didn't know what had changed. Did it notice that it would die if it continued? Or did it hear its brethren tug tail and flee? But it was neither. It was the snow. Only as the dog let go of Marie and sprinted back into the woods did I see that it had started to snow again. "That's what you get," Peter called after them, the beer bottle dripping red in his hands. He snorted a few times before his blood calmed down, and he came to Marie's side. "Holy fuck," she hissed. "What the fuck was that?" Peter was livid. He didn't know what to do with his hands, them hovering usually over her. There were tears in his eyes, and I could hear how he struggled to breathe. Okay. Jonathan uttered to himself, kneeling in front of Marie. "Paul," he said to me, "hold your phone light in front of me. I need to examine her wound." I wasn't teetering on the edge of a panic attack like Peter, but believe me, I was pissing myself right that moment. Once Jonathan gave me a clear order, I got control back over my body, my shacking hands struggling to hold the light still. If I did a horrible job. Jonathan said nothing, checking the wound through the torn shreds of Marie's jeans. Peter," Marie groaned. "Give me your hand. I need something to squeeze." The words had to make their way through the brain fog that had veiled Peter's brain before he gave his hand to her. "Don't worry, big guy," she said to him. "Everything will be fine. But you, come on, tell me a stupid joke of yours. I need something to laugh at." Peter wiped away a tear, a nervous laughter escaping him. We now know what to expect from our traps." No idea whether Mary found that actually funny, but she laughed, calming Peter. "Okay, they broke skin," Jonathan said. "Yeah, I'm bleeding, I know," she responded. "But there is no fur sticking in it. We need to clean the wound with something like warm water. Do any of you bring water?" Jonathan clicked with his tongue as we shook our heads. Sweat dangled down from his forehead, his eyes darting back and forth. "Okay, fuck it," Jonathan said. "We will do makeshift bandage right now. I have." Without missing a beat, Peter ripped the left sleeve of his jacket. He held it in front of Jonathan, who stared at, his expression shifting into a frown. "What? No, I have." "Okay, whatever." He took the ripped sleeve and wrapped it around Marie's wound as tight as he could. Marie hissed, clawing into Peter's hand, who endured it in silence. "We will carry her back to my car, and then we will drive to the nearest hospital. Paul, as soon as we are out of here, and you got signal again, I want you to use Google Maps, okay? You will tell me which way to go, okay?" I nodded, and Jonathan looked at Peter. Peter, do you hear me?" He snapped his finger in front of Peter until he caught his attention. "You will be in the back seat with Marie. I will drive fast, so you will have to make sure she's good. You got that? Peter, did you get that?" "Yeah. Good. Let's move. Come on, go." Peter wanted to carry Marie on his own, but Jonathan convinced him in one bark that we would carry her together. Another sound came from outside the church, resembling a kind of thud, as if someone had slammed against something. The wind had picked up, and the descending snow mixed with the fog made it impossible to see whether the dogs had returned, but that didn't matter. Peter's head turned crimson, veins popping on his forehead. Those dumb motherfuckers. He picked up his bloody beer bottles and rushed out of the church. "Want another go? Try, and I'll rip you open from your ass to your mouth." "For fuck's sake," Jonathan cursed. "What are you doing?" We had started to get Marie up, but we had to put her down again as we hurried after Peter. "Peter, get your ass back right now," Jonathan shouted. He stood between the statues, looking for the dogs. The weather had started to swallow their tracks. No new paw prints leading towards the church as far as we could see. But there was something. I can barely remember thanks to the entire situation, but it definitely sounded like a thud. Peter's knuckles turned white by how he gripped his weapons. "Come one," he whispered to himself, his words nearly lost to the wind. Jonathan griped Peter by the shoulder and turned him towards him. "Peter, I understand you're mad. We all are, but this is pointless, okay?" "They fucking attacked her," he shouted. I know. They could attack again. We have to find them. And right now, Marie is more important. She's injured. She could get rabies if we don't get her to the hospital ASAP. Peter's anger faded away, replaced by uncertainty. Fuck, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Yeah, sure. Now get your ass in there and help us. Guys, wait, I said, holding a finger to my lips. Listen. Since we got out of the church, something had bothered me. My senses had picked up on a trail but failed to give me a clear picture of what. But now I heard it. Following the wind, acting like a supporting melody to it, hidden inside its greater sound backdrop, someone was breathing. In long rasts, they took air into their damaged lungs, having an eerie similarity to an elder person on their deathbed. The others heard it too. Unfortunately, we failed to see it though. When we got into the church, there were 6 statues, not 7. Following my stare, Peter turned around in time for the figure with long white hair to leap at him. It tore him right off his feet, sinking its teeth into his neck. The mess of hair nearly reached its lower back, hiding most of its body. But despite that, one could easily identify it as humanoid. This strange thing ripped at Peter's flesh, starving to taste his blood. Peter grounded his teeth, pain turning his face white, as he rammed his beer bottles into the thing's side. Jonathan took hold of the white hair, pulling at it while I stomped hard on its neck. I didn't aim for the head out of fear of hitting Peter. As Peter stabbed his attacker, his weapon often struck its rib cage. It was starved to a similar degree to the dog's from before, its bones visible underneath its pale blue skin. Whatever that monster was, it couldn't endure our assault for long. With a sickening sound, he ripped out a junk from Peter's neck and ran away on all fours, reminding me of a beaten monkey. This is the point where it will get difficult to write more. Peter had paled, blood pouring out of his wound. His breathing, hectic at first, grew weaker. Jonathan had lost his cool for the first time, mouth wide open, not knowing what to do. This time I tore off my sleeve, holding it to Jonathan. We have to wrap it around him, I managed to say, my voice shaking, burdened by fresh tears. Jonathan nodded, thought returning to his mind. He worked surprisingly efficient for being taken by shock. We have to run. I nodded and hurried into the church to get Marie. She had seen some of it, asking in a shrill voice what had happened. As she saw Peter leaning heavy on Jonathan's shoulder, the upper part of the wrecked jacket turned red. She slapped her hand over her mouth, a silent sob escaping her lips. To my car, and then the sound came again. The thud, but louder and more numerous. As if to torture us, the fog lit for a moment, revealing more of our surroundings. The attacker stood near a tree, letting out a howl, its voice raw and damaged, like a rusted sword with chunks of its blade missing. As a response, the thuds grew in intensity. Now we knew where it came from. The graves. The first hand ripped through the soil, so scrawny it appeared to be nothing but a skeleton with skin wrapped around it. Its long nails were sharpened, perfect for piercing flesh. The other followed suit, like twisted trees emerging from the earth, birthing a forest that reeked of death. Only one grave was already dug out, the same Peter had slammed his foot against. Marie whimpered, and Jonathan's face cramped up, horror twisting his features. Run, I shouted. High Wraith or where the children play. The earth opened and the monsters came, and it was the end of the world. But it didn't feel like it because we were still here. There was never a time I can remember where the creatures did not lurk in the shadows, kidnapping stray helpless children or hapless adults. Sometimes it would be that someone of Golgotha would go missing, and whispers over breakfast would be the consequences of it. Funerals were frivolous, even if there were sometimes candles lit in the absence of the missing. Generally, it would be the elders that would sit around wooden tables, hum old hymns, and maybe they would whisper a few kind words to Elohim or Allah, or perhaps a more pagan variety. I came from a fully loaded Christian household where the paganistic murmurs were often seen as little better than the monsters that came from the earth. Whatever the case may be, it was simple mourning, simple human mourning, and it was sad and miserable and more numbing every time I'd see it happen. Sometimes it would be Lady. She was an old shamanistic-style woman with tattered robes and graying hair, even some whiskers on her chin too, that would culminate a hymn in the streets with her incense or more for the missing. But it was Christian and good in that way. Always about Jesus, always good clean words and simple gospels that were quiet and weak. It was a young woman that had gone missing sometime the previous night. There'd been a patrol sent out among the old ruins too, because the missing girl was the daughter of a boss. The bosses were distinguished leaders in Golgotha, due to their tendency for extreme and untempered cruelty, and whenever someone crossed a boss, or whenever a boss lost something precious, everyone took notice, because the bosses controlled the functions of Golgotha. It just so happened the boss whose daughter went missing was also the fellow that controlled the water supply. His name was Harold, and that wily son of a gun shut off the pumps that moved groundwater into our homes. He was the only one with the key and said he'd not divulge it to a soul if the girl wasn't returned. Some of the boys on the compound cultivated a posse with impassioned cries of mutual aid and such, but Boss Harold, no matter how much they threatened or how many of his fingers they snapped in their desperate grasp for humanity, would not comply. Most of the boys surmised it was likely the girl was dead, and her remains would be impossible to find due to the way monsters tended to grind bones into powder and dry swallow even the gristle of our fragile bodies. There'd be nothing left. Or if there was anything left of her, it wouldn't be her any longer. Assuredly she'd be a husk or unworthy of saving. When hard torture failed, the boys cried for more reason, and yet Boss Harold would not budge. The old boss said, "I'll stop the motor of the world until she's found." A group of rabble-rousing youths had absconded with his daughter, or so he said. The reality was much more likely that she had run from home of her own free will, either by wanderlust or ignorance. When all was said and done, the families came to me and said, "Hey Harlan, buddy, pal, you've lost weight. You're looking good. Mr. Harlan, did you get a haircut?" I heard about the girl. I'd heard about the posse sent out to Boss Harold's abode. The compound ain't that big, and knew they'd be coming for me because I was a scaver, a person that wades through the old ruins either for illusory history pages or weapons or even, and this one was a rare treat, lost people. I knew they'd come for my services and had already put together my pack for travels with rations and light tools. No gun. Drawing attention in the old ruins was a dumb thing because sound could travel forever. I'm going. I told the group that had been sent for me. I don't reckon any of you'd like to come with me. I looked over the dirty faces, the faces of men, women, children that could scarcely be called grown, and none stood out because they were all tired and dirty, and I imagined I looked much the same. Then a girl's voice broke out from the crowd, and she stumbled forward from the line of strangers that had come to see me at my door. "I'll go," she said. "I want to go with you, Mr. Harlan." It was unsurprising. Youngsters always thought the old ruins were like a field trip, like maybe they'd find a souvenir for their sweetie and come home with a good story. Most didn't come back, and those that did usually came back with scars beneath the skin from what they'd seen in the out there. It was like a game for them, and when they saw what the world outside the walls held, they would retreat into themselves for fear. It wasn't just the monsters. It was the ruins themselves, the overwhelming demolition of us. We were gone, and yet we were here. It's a hard thing to cope. I looked over the skinny girl with a grimy face. She couldn't have been older than 16. Her hair was cropped very short, and I could see no immediate deformities that might slow my travels. So I asked, "What did your parents say?" Without flinching, the girl shouldered her pack straps with her thumbs and almost cheerily answered, "They're dead, sir." "Don't call me sir." I stepped nearer her, looked over her face, and saw perhaps a will I'd not seen in some time. Maybe she would be more of a help than a hindrance. "Do you have everything you need?" Yes. Then we leave immediately. I shouldered my own pack and followed up with, do not bring any fucking guns. Got it. No fucking guns. Her tone was sarcastic, but not unserious. It was the best I could hope for, and besides, it was always better whenever I traveled with someone else. We took off from my small hidey hole and moved through the narrow stretches of street. Tall metal and concrete stood on either of our sides, mostly housing and hydroponics, with a few spots with stools where a person could stop in for a drink of cool water. Although a few of the bosses had toyed with the idea of expanding the hydroponics so that we might produce corn whiskey in bulk, this was scrapped when the math was done. The space was insufficient for such luxuries, but this did not stop some from fermenting small berries in batches when no one else was paying attention. Wine was incredibly rare, had a moldy taste to it, but was sweet and a further reminder of maybe why we held on. I liked wine pretty good, but sometimes I'd find an old bottle in the ruins or get a jug of liquor from one of the far settlements, and that's what I really cherish. You ever been out of town? I asked her. No. Don't act a hero. Don't be funny out there. Don't make noise. Don't get in my way. If I tell you something, you do it without questions. First, I heard her footsteps fall slowly, then more quickly before she answered me, as though she had to stop and think about what she was going to do next. Perhaps she was having second thoughts. Don't try to scare me from the ruins, she said. I've wanted to go out there for years now, and everyone always says there's old stuff. Our old stuff. Stuff that used to belong to us. Used to belong to us. What do you mean? Humans, or whatever. It used to be ours. It hasn't been ours within my lifetime. Leave it to them, because it's theirs now. If you find some small thing out there that you like, then take it. But otherwise, it ain't home no more. There was no need for me to elaborate on who I meant whenever I said them, because anyone knew exactly who they were. The creatures from beneath the earth, the demons, the monsters. We came to the outer sections of town near the gate, and the walls stood high over our heads while morning breeze kicked up spirals of sand wisps across the ground. The walls were probably 50 or 60 feet tall and several yards thick with titanium and concrete and rebar. Along the parapets of our fortifications were patrolmen that watched the horizon and fired at anything that moved with 50 caliber bullets. The men up there, and they were mostly men, the show-off types, wore ballistic weaves, bent and tarnished war helmets of the past, and carried mottled fatigue colors on their bodies like for real militiamen. There hadn't been an attempt on Golgotha from the monsters in days. It was a quiet week. The nearest dirt street spilled into an open square with sandbag barricades overlooking the gate from atop a small hill. I waved down Maron. Boss Maron wore boots and an old-school cowboy hat with an aluminum star pinned on its forehead center. He swaggered over. "Going out, Mr. Harlan." His mustache caterpillar wiggled, nearly obscuring a toothy grin. I nodded. "It's 'cause Harold, ain't it?" I nodded. "You know that crazy bastard had some of my guards lock up the boys that stormed his home. If you ask me, he deserved whatever pain those fellas brought to him for shutting the pumps off." I idly studied the sidearm holstered on his hip, then looked at the nearby guards by the gate, each with automatic weapons slung across their chests. "You still locked them up, didn't you?" Boss Maron spat in the dirt by his feet and laughed a little dry. "Sure did. Harold's got the key to the water, and I won't be crossing him. Don't want the riffraff questioning bosses." He flapped his hand at the notion, then swaggered away and waved at his guards to open the gate. The one nearest a breaker box on the right-hand side of the gate opened the electrical panel, flipped a switch, then the hydraulics on the gate began to decompress as it unlocked and rusty gears began to rock across one another to slide the great, tall metal door open. "Try not to lose any fingers or toes while you're out there." "Oh." He seemed to take notice of the young girl following me. "Got a new companion. Does she know what's happened to the last few that's traversed those desperate lands with you?" asked the girl. "Oh, Harlan." Boss Maron smiled so hard I'd think his mustache might fall off his face from the sheer tension of the skin beneath it. He's a real globetrotter, quite a deal maker, but just don't be surprised if he leaves you behind. This was followed by a sick chuckle. I refused to respond and merely watched the clockwork gate come to a full open, while the guards on either side prepared to angle their guns at the opening like they half expected something to come barreling towards them. The doorway was empty, and through the haze of the wasteland, I could scarcely make out the familiar angles of the old ruins far out. The girl didn't engage either, for which I was thankful. Boss Maron wide-stepped closer, then patted my shoulder and whispered in my ear, "Don't forget the shiny flag." He tucked a foil sheet into my front shirt pocket. His daughter was due west, supposedly. Good luck. Then he clapped me on the back before returning to his post by the sandbags, where a small table displayed his game of solitaire. We moved through the gate, and I could sense the uneasy rhythm of the young girl's movement just over my shoulder. As the gate closed behind us with a large and final shudder, I heard her breath become more erratic. "The air feels thicker out here," she said. "It is sometimes." I try talking the nerves out of her. "It's hot and cold all at the same time, ain't it? Know what I mean? It's hot devil air, but also you feel chills all over, don't you?" "Yeah." Her pace quickened so that we walked alongside one another. "It's just the nerves. You get used to it. Or you don't get enough time to." What did old Maron mean about other people dying with you? Not many people venture outside the compound, and even fewer go into the ruins. It's all very dangerous. Most don't make it back. That's all he meant. But you do. Make it back, I mean. I sighed. "I do, yeah. My name's Aggie, by the way. Sorry I didn't say that before, Mr. Harlan. What did your parents do when they were still around?" Dad was a farmer that worked with the hydroponics, and Mom was a general fixer. She liked making clothes when we had the material. "Good people, it sounds like." "Sometimes," said Aggie. "Hey, please don't let me die, all right?" The words weren't constructed so much as blurted. They came as a joke, but did not seem like one. Okay, for a mile out in a measured circle, there was open, sandy, flat ground stretching from around the perimeter walls of Golgotha. All the clutter, junk, and buildings had been disposed of years prior to grant the compound snipers comfortable sights in all directions. The openness went out for a mile, and in every direction. One could see the ruins, the crumpled dead vehicles, half-snapped spires that lie in angles, and the gloom-red tint in the air that seemed to emanate from the ground like heat waves off fire. It was scared air, where the creatures had unearthed some great anomaly from beneath the dirt. In honesty, it was like passing through the foul stench of death and painted everything in a blood hue. It stank, and it was hot, and it was cold. We moved in relative silence. Only the sounds of our boots across granular dirt, or the clink of zippers whenever either Aggie or I was to readjust the packs on our shoulders. As we came upon the edges of the ruins, where we entered the red mist, and the air was alien. Finally, Aggie cleared her throat and mentioned through mildly exerted breathing, "Think we'll find her." "I don't know," I answered. "Keep quiet and whisper. We can talk, but keep it low." We began to enter the thick of the ruins, where ancient structures crept up on either side of us. "What made you come with me?" It was a question I'd wondered the whole time, and figured her reasoning was weak. "There's not much home. I'd like to see some of the world before I go. Seems like things get worse and worse, and for when I do leave this world, I want to see something other than the walls of home." Fair answer. Her reasoning was weak. "What if you've bit off more than you can chew?" "Maybe." She followed this up with another question of her own. "What made you start venturing out?" I wanted to see something other than the walls of home. I felt a smile creep around the corners of my mouth, but quickly tempered myself. Whenever people go out on their own without a guide, they die. I doubt we'll find Harold's daughter. I left a pause. "You're nearly her age, ain't you? Did you ever know her?" "You speak like she's dead for sure." "Most likely, she is. Did you know her?" "No, but I guess I'm an optometrist." "Optimist. I corrected. Whatever. She's a piece of home. I feel like I'm old enough to take care of myself, and I want to help people. Not everyone thinks that way, but we're all one big family, aren't we? While I appreciate your thoughts on it, I doubt the daughter of a boss would feel the same about you. The bosses protect us. The ruins began to swallow us whole as we ventured through the ancient pathways. Broken asphalt and wreckage littered the wide open street. A nearby, worn post named the path, Fifth Haven. I'd gone there before and left most things untouched, although there were a few open holes in the structures on either side, places where large entryways might have gone hundreds of years ago. They were mostly empty, black with shadow, and picked clean long ago. Non-ideal for an alcove of respite from the open air. We shifted down the street, my eyes darting from old signs and vehicles bent and rusted and abandoned. I motioned for Aggie to come closer as I sneaked through the rubble towards a wall where there were no entryways into the monolithic structures. We hugged the wall and moved with trepidation, sometimes climbing across overturned wreckage, tiptoeing in our boots to muffle all sound. Every footfall felt like a scream. We should go on for another mile or so before we find a place to rest. I know one up the way. Rest? Are you tired already? That'd burn what daylight we have, said Aggie. I shook my head. The last thing you want is to be without your wits in a place like this. If you're too tired to run, you're too tired to live. Aren't they fast? If they catch you in the open, they'll get you, won't they? I thought of a lie, then thought better. Yes, if you see one, don't scream. Don't even breathe. If they haven't seen you, you still have a chance. The air grew wet and smelled of chlorine, and I snatched Aggie's sweating hand in my own before grappling her into my arms. She was small and fought noiselessly for only a second before going still. I shifted us into a concrete doorway with a half-destroyed awning and whispered a quick hush as I glided us near a piece of wreckage. I felt her tenseness leave and let go of her before she crouched alongside me in the shadowed cover of an old van that had, ages before, slammed into a nearby wall. The door of the vehicle had been removed, and we angled in slowly, silently, crawling towards the rear of its cabin to peer from the broken windows, all the while hoping its old axles would not creak. Feeling her hand on my shoulder, I twisted round to look Aggie in the eye. Terror erupted from her face in tremors while she mouthed the words. What's that? Simply, I put a finger to my lips and took a peek at the thing moving down Fifth Haven. The creature was on the smaller side, closer to the size of a run-of-the-mill human, but twitched its muscles in a fashion that contested humanity. The thing walked upright on 2 feet, but sometimes used its hands to move like an animal. The most intricate and disturbing of its features, however, was its head, with vibrant green skin, with speckles of yellowed globules across the surface of its body, likely filled with creamy pus, with a misshapen balloon head that first opened in half with a mouth folded as an anus, dispersed a corrosive gas into the air while it deflated, then reinflated and quivered. The creature's head moved as a sack filled with misty gas, wobbly and rubbery. It had no eyes, no other features besides that awful head. We watched it go, stop, disperse its toxic mist into the air, then leave. I kept my eyes on it, nose and mouth tucked beneath the collar of my shirt, and glanced at Aggie to see she'd followed suit. The smell could choke. Once I was certain the thing had decided to move well outside of earshot, not that it had ears, I motioned for Aggie to follow me out of the van, down the sidewalk, through an intersection of roads, and into a small opening in one of the smaller structures. Our feet were swift, and I was grateful she was graceful. We moved through the darkness of the structure, and I led with intimate knowledge of the place. There was a safe spot near the rear of the building. I reached out in the dark, felt a handle, and pushed into a small closet, and pulled Aggie through. My lantern came alive and bathed us in a warm glow. Shelves across the small room were lined with various supplies I'd left. A few boxes of matches, oil for lanterns, a bedroll, blankets, and other miscellaneous baubles. Aggie inhaled sharply. I've never seen anything like that. It was I don't know. It was weird and gross. Little scary. Is that what they look like? I shifted around onto the floor and opened my pack while placing the lantern between my legs. You've been up on the compound's walls before, ain't you? Once. Well, sometimes those things get closer to home. I don't know what you'd call them. Some of the wall guys call them fart heads because when you shoot one in the head with a rifle, it goes puffed. Lot of that chlorine shit comes out of them too. Do bullets kill them? She asked while removing her own pack and fixing her legs alongside mine in the closet. It was a snug fit, but we managed. Like really kill them, or does it just empty those heads? I could feel her shaking still. If you use enough, sure. Durable, but manageable if you have enough firepower. Those are small fries. Normally, they wouldn't sneak up on me though. Normally, I'd smell them from far off before they ever get close. Did I distract you? Maybe. I didn't mean to. It was bound to happen, I reckon. I plunged my hand into my pack and removed a water gourd, taking a deep swallow from it. She started. She stopped, then started again. I wish. Another stop came, then she gave up on whatever she was going to say and laid her pack across her lap, seemingly searching for something within. We should rest up here for a while, at least until you've calmed yourself. Then we'll set out. Marin said the girl went west. You should have that detail in case this trip happens to be my last. I figured we'd search the northern area first, then make our way south. But I hope she ain't south. I exposed the face of my compass. A thought seemed to occur to Aggie while she removed her own water gourd and took a healthy swig. Sweat glistened off her brow in the dancing light of the lantern. Its fire caught in her pupils while she thought. You don't actually think you'll find her, do you? I grinned, surprised. Why do you say that? You think she's dead already, so why do it? Because they'll believe me when I come back. I suppose we'll return in 2 days, maybe 3, then tell them we found her corpse. Well, why don't we just stay here for the remainder? We'll look for her, I said. But why? It's the right thing to do, I suppose. Maybe your optometristism is rubbing off on me. Don't make fun of me, said Aggie, but I could see her sheepish grin. She held out a hand flat across her eyes and watched the nervous tremors in her fingers. Just nerves, I told her. It's a little exciting. Now that's a dangerous thought. I took another swig from my water gourd before returning it to my pack. Do you know where your parents hailed from? Somewhere up north. Cold lands, but it was hard not to freeze in the winter up that way. Said they came down here years before I was born, hoping they could find a place to settle, but it was all the same. That's what they said. Never been further north than Golgotha. If I'm being honest, I'm from a place that once was called Georgia, but I've not been there in years. Is it true what they told me, Mr. Harlan? What do you mean? Is it the same everywhere? Is there no place around that's not got those awful things? If there's a place like that, I haven't seen it yet. Mom used to read to me when I was a little kid. She said I never could pick up reading, but she loved old books that were written before bad times, and in those books, people talked about things like green fields that stretched on forever, and places where water streams were clear enough to drink from. Do you remember anything like that? I chuckled while continuing to rummage through my pack. Geez, how old do you think I am? All that was a long time ago. Yeah, you think it'll ever be like that again? I shook my head, wishful thinking. Then I found what I'd been searching for and removed it from my pack. A small tin of tobacco. I sat to rolling a makeshift cigarette, then lit it off the lamp. That smells funny. Yeah. We shared the cigarette in the dark closet, passing it back and forth. Her lungs, not being used to the smoke, forced from Aggie a few whimpering coughs that she tried to hide in the hem of her shirt. I ducked the tobacco out beneath my heel and began reorganizing my pack so that it was less lumpy. I hope you're ready for it again. Like I said, that one you saw was a small fry. There's bigger things out there, worse things. Should I go, or should I just stay here? She hadn't reorganized herself at all and remained seated while I shouldered my pack and peered through a crack in the door. Of course, you should come with me. I know it. You're scared. What if I make it worse and I attract one of those things right to you? She asked. I reached down and she took my hand. I lifted her to her feet and we met eyes. Aggie, you're coming with me. You'll do fine. I promise. It was not often that I'd try and charm someone, but I put forth a smile. She smiled back, and I shut off my lantern before leading her gently through the dark, into the open street where midday sun caught the ruins' shadows long and deep. West was where the girl had gone, and I intended to follow. Though I'd seen no signs of survivors, I was certain that if they'd braved the previous night, they were likely about in the daytime. Certainly, things would be made easier if I could cup hands around my mouth and echo my voice through the dead city like a game of Marco Polo. Aggie maintained both energy and quiet alongside me as we moved through the rubble, vaulting over wide open holes in the street where I could spy the arteries of the dead beast, the old sewer network. We conversed frankly and in whispers when we came upon a place in the road that was impassable on foot due to a collapsed structure, and we stalked more like wounded deer in a forest than humans in a city. Our shoulders remained slouched, our bodies were huddled near to each other, and we delved into the dark recesses of another building, possibly a market from old days when patrons congregated for frozen fish sticks. There were massive steel shelves, and we took their avenues till we came upon an aperture on the far side of the dark building. We shifted over the broken glass of an old torn-out window and landed firmly on an open street. Then came a sound like firecrackers, and I felt cold, and Aggie's eyes went wide in the dull evening glow of the sun. Someone's brought a gun, I said. Before she could say anything, I hugged the wall on our side of the street and moved down the sidewalk, following the sound of those gunshots. Maybe it's someone that could help us, she tried. I shook my head. What do you mean? She whispered a bit louder. It's bad news, I said, then came to a full stop at a corner while another hail of bullets spat from some unseen weapon and echoed all around. We were getting much closer. Have you ever seen a dead body? I asked Aggie. She shook her head, but then stopped. I was the one that found my mom. She was stiff and cold. She went peacefully. Aggie shook her head. Flu. Any blood? No. If you're not ready for blood, you might not want to look. We rounded the corner to find a small blockade of burnt-out vehicles, creating a barrier between us and the action. Two men with assault rifles fired at a creature towering over them. The creature in question stood 30 feet tall on spindly legs like a spider, but each of its legs were tumorous, and its muscles were strangely uneven and mushy. Although an arachnid may have 8 legs, this one moved sluggishly along on no less than 20 shambling stilts, so that the rounded body where the legs met looked more akin to a sea urchin. Several of its long legs stood out on its sides to angle its body through the narrow corridor of the street, its whiskery feet pushing along the walls of buildings overhead. Its whole body stank of wet dog and brimstone. The men, they looked like young militiamen of Golgotha, staggered in awe of the thing and attempted to walk backwards while reloading. Another spray of bullets erupted from their rifles, and they were empty, and the men screamed, and one of them tripped across some unseen thing on the ground. Quick as a fly, one of the massive creature's legs sprang onto the prone man's abdomen. There was a brief cry of pain, and then I felt Aggie pinch onto my shoulder with her thumb and forefinger, and I glanced at her to see she'd chewed into the corner of her bottom lip for purchase in response to such a fantastical display of awfulness. The man had no skin, no clothes. He'd been stripped to runny red fibrous tissue with strips of white muscle that twitched in the presence of the air. "Oh God, please God," screamed the other man while watching his comrade writhe in pain beneath the stocky foot of the skin taker. I shuffled lower among the arrangement of vehicles we'd taken refuge behind, and me and Aggie breathed softly, glancing eye contact while sitting in the dirt. There wasn't anything to say. The sound of the spider creature removing the second man's skin was slower, torturous, seemingly enjoyed. His screams did not end for too long. I fisted my hands into my jacket pockets, then stared at the ground between my knees. I felt Aggie's thin fingers reach into my pocket, and it took me flinching to realize she intended to hold my hand. She was shaking, and I was shaking, but she was good, and did not scream. And we held hands while we listened to the thick trunks of the spider creatures shift on away. And we didn't move, and we were statues frozen like we belonged among the dead ruins. And we didn't move. And then Aggie shifted to look before I'd gathered my feelings, and motioned me on. "What's that?" she asked as simply as she'd asked the color of the sky. "Bad." I shook my head and looked for an opening in the blockade of vehicles. 2 meaty blood ponds marked where the men were, and on approach, I covered my face in the collar of my shirt. Aggie lifted her forearm to her nose. The stench of the beast and of the viscera was strong in the air. I examined the ground, then found one of their rifles, standard N16. The strap on the rifle was frayed to ribbons, and the barrel of the gun appeared to be slightly bent, but salvageable. I handed the rifle to Aggie, and she took it. "What about no guns?" she asked. "There's no bullets left. Besides, it'll be good to bring it back." Examining what was left of the bodies, my eyes went away and into my mind, where all things become ethereal and difficult to grasp. I looked without seeing and imagined a place where green grass was, a place like in the books Aggie's mother read. No grass here, just misery. "Who were they?" she asked. "The men. Yeah. They sent out a patrol looking for Boss Harold's daughter. Looks like we found it. Never should have sent them." "I want to go home," said Aggie. "Me too." I blinked and shifted around to look at her through the red hue that had gathered between us. Try as I might, the smile on my face almost hurt. "If you stick with me, you'll be safe." We took up in one of the safe houses I'd developed over the past several years, a room hidden up 2 flights of stairs and large enough to host a party. In the lantern glow we heated rations, eggs and hearty bread with water-thinned weak tomato paste, then ate in relative quiet, so that the only thing heard were our jaws over the food that tasted bitter. Food always felt slimy and bitter in the ruins where the demons reigned supreme. Their stink was on us, like sulfur, like rot, like sorrow. I rolled us each a cigarette, and we smoked while looking out through a brackish window that overlooked the black street. No lights in the darkness save blinking yellow eyes caught for moments in dull moonlight whose owners quickly skittered towards an alley. "How don't you get lost?" asked Aggie. "I do sometimes." "You could have fooled me. I mean, I know the ruins fine enough, I reckon, but then I feel like I'm drowning in it every time I come here." I took a long draw from my cigarette, finished it, then planted it beneath my boot. "Did you have parents?" she asked. "Everyone has parents." "What were they like?" Aggie held her cigarette out from her like she didn't actually want it. But just as I looked over at her, pulling my eyes from the window, she jammed it into her lips. "They were fine. Just fine. Just fine, yeah." "I wish it was better," said Aggie. "Don't imagine there's ever been a point in history where we didn't want it to be better. Maybe." She coughed through smoke. I moved to dim the lamp and sat atop my bedroll. "You should sleep." "Don't think I could sleep. I'll have nightmares." She pitched the remainder of her cigarette. "Can't be worse than the real deal." I shut off the lamp, and we laid in pitch black. "How do you do it?" she asked. "Most of the time, it feels like I'm not." I stared at the ceiling I couldn't see. "Go to sleep." At daybreak, we ate bread and water, then gathered our things before setting into that awful wasteland. Sand gathered around our legs in wisps as we trundled tiredly onto the street of the ruins, and Aggie said nothing. There wasn't a thought in my mind as my joints protested at us climbing over the wreckage of an overturned semi-truck. First I went, then I hoisted Aggie up by her lanky arms, then we jumped onto the other side, moving less like scouts and more like hungover comer-downers. Passing through the ruins, each step feeling more like a glide and less creaky, Aggie spoke from over my shoulder as I kept my eyes sharp on the building's shadows. I doubt we'll find her, she said. What happened to the optimism? I shifted to catch her face. She seemed dejected, tired, perhaps disillusioned by the previous day's happenings. I didn't know there were things like that in this world. Like that spider thing. Those men didn't stand a chance. I shook my head, and we continued moving. There are worse things still over the horizon. Most assuredly there is. Now you asked me before why I come out here in these ruins, why I've trekked the wasteland, and I'll give you the opportunity to ask it again. Maybe I'll have something different to say. Okay, why then? Because I kicked at a half-eroded aluminum can left on the ground. Places like Golgotha, or even where I've come from. There's nothing like the red sky or the open road. There are no ties, no people. There's only the next step. She took up directly beside me as we turned onto a street corner where the sidewalk mostly remained intact. Sounds stupid to me. There it is then. Sorry, she muttered, then she spoke even more clearly. I didn't mean it like that. I just don't get it. It's because I'm a deal maker, I said. That's what Maron called you before, wasn't it? Aggie absently stared at the sky, at the edges of the high spires overhead that seemed to swallow us whenever clouds passed over the sun. What's that mean? It means it's harder for me to die. Just luck, if you ask me. I clenched my jaw. Probably, it is. Yeah. Then, with time, we came to the garden, a place in the ruins where greenery existed, even if the plants that grew from the soil were otherworldly and aggressive. There was the solitary sound of dirt-catching crags in the structures as hard wind pushed silt through the narrow streets of the ruins. Then there was also the sound of a flute made of bone and skin. The sound was sickly sweet, elusive, something no human could play even if they listened carefully and practiced for hundreds of years. There was the flute, the greenery, the clacking of hooves against old stone that had risen from the earth, much the same as the demons. Aggie whispered, "What's that music?" I reached out my hand so that she would hold it, and I tried to smile. There are worse things still over the horizon. Her delicate, scrawny fingers wrapped around my own, and though I felt her trembling, she trusted me. I hoped she really did. I led her towards the garden, through a walkway with tall obelisks of flame on either side. "What is this place?" whimpered Aggie. "If you are asked your name, tell it plainly without hesitation." I said, "Do not leave my side. Do not run." "Where are we going?" Her eyes scanned the garden, the flames dancing in the midday reddish light, the trees bent at impossible angles, the glorious green grass that looked cool and soft. I'd been in awe the first time I'd seen it. I smiled. "Just like your mom's old books. Green grass." The flute grew louder as we came closer, and the hoof beats on stone shifted with enthusiasm. There in the center of the garden stood Baphomet, 10 feet tall, feminine midsection with goatish head and legs. It pranced with the flute to its mouth, and the tune resounded playfully all around. The creature danced across an area of stones in the center of the garden, a place where there were rock tables and chairs and sigils upon the ground. Amid the open furniture, there stood a throne of human bones, and near where Baphomet played its wily tune, there was a covered well, rope tautly hanging from its crank, as if there was something heavy on the other end. "I smelled you coming," said Baphomet. Even as it spoke, it continued to play its flute without pause, its muscular shoulders glistening with reddish sweat, its horns gloriously pointed, and reveled in its merriment. "Let us convene," I said, mouth dry and feeling heady. "Convene. I'm here for the girl." I felt Aggie shift uncomfortably beside me, but I kept my eyes locked on Baphomet. "It seems you have one already. She came west, towards here 2 days ago. She was a runaway. You have her. Come, Harlan, come and dance with me." Baphomet did not stop its flute or its dancing. I sighed. "I'm here to make a deal." Baphomet froze, allowing the bony flute to drop from its goatish lips. Its animal eyes casually switched between me then Aggie, before it turned to face us completely. A deal. Ah yes. I nearly choked. You've brought so little to bargain with. Baphomet shifted and walked to its throne to sit, clacking its long nails against the armrest. Unless. The creature allowed the word to hang against my brain like a splinter. I lifted the hand holding Aggie's. A deal. I tried. Quick as a flash, Baphomet disappeared in a haze of black smoke, then reappeared over Aggie's shoulder. I dropped her hand and stepped away while the creature exhausted dew from its nose before sniffing Aggie's ear. Aggie swallowed hard. Harlan, she asked, what's it doing? I'm sorry, Aggie. Baphomet took its hands through her short hair and inhaled sharply. A long tongue fell from its mouth and saliva oozed before it snapped its snout shut. The pleasure will be all mine. Harlan, let's go. I want to go home. Aggie's tears rolled down her face in full while the large hand of Baphomet lightly squeezed her cheeks into a pucker. You are home. Baphomet took Aggie and moved her casually. Her legs moved feebly, knees shaking. Sit, darling, said Baphomet, motioning to its throne. Aggie took the chair, and the creature snorted approval. The demon moved jauntily to the well, where its strong arms began to roll the crank. With each rotation, the sound of cries grew closer, until finally, all limbs pulled backwards in bondage. There dangled Boss Harold's daughter. Deep cuts and blood painted her mangled, distorted body. She'd been pushed into the well belly first, suspended by her wrists and ankles. I bit my tongue. Oh God, I heard Aggie say. It sounded like a far-off girl from an unknown planet. Baphomet lifted the girl from her bondage, then sliced the rope with a razor-sharp fingernail. I hesitantly moved closer to the scene and removed my jacket. Don't be so scared, Harlan. If ever you yearn the ecstasy of my company, all you ever need is ask. Otherwise, I won't touch you. Baphomet's speech was paced, toneless, without emotion, and yet I felt pinpricks spring across my body. I moved towards Harold's daughter and draped my coat around her. She can't walk. I saw the deep bruising, the bewildered fluttering of her eyelids, the places the demon had branded her flesh. I lifted the girl, totally unsure whether she would die from a fever. With her slung over my shoulder, I could smell infection, and went from the garden, Aggie calling after me. And I could hear it all as I met the street, and crossed it and re-entered the ruins. Although arduous with the squalling, quivering body of the girl, I moved as quickly as I could. Shay. I told her and myself, Shay. Perhaps I was shaking too. I heard the protests of Aggie. First she asked for me, then there was nothing but the siren call of the betrayed. The shrieks, the howls in response to Baphomet's tortures. There would be water again on the compound. I moved away and readjusted the girl on my shoulder before I stumbled over my own boots. We fell hard on my knees, but I kept her in my arms and muffled a cry. An old prayer whispered from my lips, and I pushed myself to my feet before going on. There was no lying to myself of what I'd done. What I'd done too many times. It never was easier. Never. Nothing like youthful, fresh flesh placates a demon. It's a deal that I'd made before and a deal I was certain I'd make again. There were no heroes or beauty in the world. No wonderful overcoming or examinations of the indomitable human spirit. The girl's pained expressions dampened to mere whimpers alongside flashes of weak, flailing hysteria. Her infection was bad, and I was glad for her continued pain, because it meant she was alive. Once I'd found a place, perhaps a mile out from the garden, deep in the buildings of the tall ruins, I deposited her on the sidewalk, then looked over her. She looked thin, famished, soul-famished, and her eyes could not hold a concentrated gaze. Only after surveying the surrounding area, I withdrew my water gourd and put it to her lips slowly, being sure as to not drown her with its contents. Her eyes shut, and she supped at the mouth of the dead gourd, not even having the energy to hold it with her hands. I examined her deep cuts. A few scabby places around her wounds demonstrated healing, but others looked too deep, and I imagined that's where the infection was. My voice whispered, "These are antibiotics. Please swallow them. Even if you need to chew them, take them." Unsure if my words had registers, I pushed the pills to her lips and her closed eyes contorted funny before I slotted the medicine past her teeth and offered her another drink of water. As expected, she chewed while drinking. I lifted her once more and walked tiredly to the safe house me and Aggie had shared the previous night. Dead weight is easily the worst part of it. The girl's limp body hung off my shoulder and reminded me that every step I took was an infinitely small conquest. "Stop it," protested the girl. "Sha," I said. "I want to go home. Don't we all? It's scary out here." Perhaps she'd momentarily gained lucidity. "Shay, you'll attract the scary things. Just be quiet." It was dark by the time we reached the building with the safe house. I fashioned a sled from an old piece of discarded sheetwood so that I could mobilize the incapacitated girl up the many stairs to my hidden place. She'd not liked it when I'd secured her to the board with the rope, and with every thump up the stairs, I half expected a creature to show, but nothing happened. I hoisted the makeshift sled by its connected rope, and it took until pitch black till we shuffled into the safe house. With the door secured, I turned my attention to her, removed my jacket from her naked shoulders, and set to cleaning her wounds with alcohol and bandaging what I thought was necessary. Even through the smell of her blood, the antiseptic, and through the smoke I'd lit, I could smell the brimstone wafting off her. It was treacherous, but I gave her a spare fit of clothes I'd brought, and while the threads hung off her too largely, at least she'd been given decency. With her tucked into a bedroll, I watched through the same windows I'd peered from the night prior, and watched the glowing eyes of creatures that parkoured across tall structures or fought amongst themselves, and every so often it seemed those eyes stared back at me through the dirty glass. But I hoped not. I secured the door each night, but was hopeful the deal would keep them at bay. Only a few times did the boss's daughter stir throughout the night, but she seemed to rest well enough as anyone could within the circumstances. There were a few times I checked the heat off her forehead and felt the temperature rising. Stripping a bit of cloth off my shirt sleeve, I dampened it and draped it across her forehead. If she'd been so unlucky as to catch a fever, then she'd die, for I had no measures against it. Sleep came in short spells for me, and I burned too much lantern oil, because there was a fantasy within me where I could go back for Aggie. It was common. It was morning, then night, then morning again, and I was breaking what little bread I had for a tough sandwich when I heard her stir from her slumber. I watched as the young woman fumbled her hands above her prone body, touching nothing. Then her eyes fluttered, and she pushed herself up so as to bend into a sitting position, arms buttressing her so that she could slowly examine the room. I moved to sit near her after placing coffee over the cooking stove. Her hand moved to her face where wounds would assuredly become scars, bad deep ones that might never heal right. Demon wounds never healed right all the way, and she flinched as her fingernails poked at the lines down her cheeks. "What's this?" Her voice was gravelly, monotone, and dry. "You're awake then?" I asked. "I think so." "Good. How are your limbs? Notice anything about them that are off? Can you feel everything?" Her jaw clenched. "I don't know if I'll feel anything again." Ignoring this, I returned to the stove and pushed the heat higher. "Can you eat? I'm thirsty." I motioned for the water gourd by her bedroll. "Can you eat? You should eat something." Greedily, she removed the cork and drank heavily, lines of water streaking down her chin. After removing the gourd from her mouth, a long sigh escaped her, and I awaited her response. But instead, the only thing that came was a wet gurgle as she slammed the water to her lips again. "The sooner you eat something, the stronger you'll get. The sooner you're strong, we'll hit the road home. I imagine you thought you'd never miss home as much as right this second, huh?" She cradled the gourd in her hands and smacked her lips. Although her eyes were weary, a tad unfocused, she seemed self-possessed enough. "I think I've met you before. I think I know you." Maybe. I shrugged. Lots of people in Golgotha have met me, but not many people know me well. I laughed but couldn't smile. That sounded cheesy. You work for my dad. I shook my head. I do things for the bosses sometimes. I don't work for anyone. Never have. But sometimes a boss needs something. I guess I'll do it. What do you do? I rescued you. Her cold stare fell from my eyes till they drifted to the wide windows that overlooked the ruins. I always thought it would be beautiful. Like a big, beautiful place. I thought it would be home. I thought it would be like dreams. My eyes followed hers where we could see the overwhelming cement work that had been done to create the ruins. Walls were hewn to show skeletal rebar, and every broken window was like a black tunnel. Each building was a tombstone. It's a graveyard. Lady said burning incense would keep the monsters away. She told me it was the only way to keep them away. Her voice was small with a hint of betrayal. Incense is good for ceremonies or preaching, but if incense was what you used to keep them away, you might as well have learned one of Lady's incantations and done a little chicken dance. I huffed. If they want you and you're there for the wanting, they'll take you. She took in more water until the gourd was empty, and then she held her stomach. Careful. If you drink too much all at once like that, you'll end up with pains. She massaged her legs and removed herself from the innards of the bedroll to sit atop it. Thank you. I swallowed hard and pulled the fresh coffee from the heat. You should eat something. Do you prefer bread or canned beans? I could smack together a sandwich for you. The choices are slim at the moment, but there's a bit of dried meat too. Why don't they take you? I gritted my teeth into what was hopefully a welcoming grin. Hush, you should eat up and try to conjure whatever energy you have. I know you've been through it, but there's more to come till we see home. Home. Indeed. I came out here with Andrew. Did you find Andrew? Her eyes momentarily illuminated with hope. Who's that? Her eyes drifted. He was going to be my husband. He said we'd be married. He's definitely dead. There was no way to tell if her sweetheart was still kicking or not, but there was no use in arguing over it. Oh, she whispered. There was a pause where she seemed to study the bedding she laid on. I didn't think it would be like this. I thought for sure that there would be something hiding out here in the wastes. There's stuff hiding, all right. I began to shrug it off, but stopped myself when I could see the tears forming in her eyes. There's always hope, I guess. We took to eating nearer the large windows overlooking the large mouthy chasms, and between swallows there were spits of conversation, but her attention was largely unconcentrated. At least her hunger was good, and she drank well. I smoked while she interrogated me further on the state of the world. All I know is Golgotha. You've been around, right? Is there any good place left? She was practically pleading the question. I ain't been all over exactly. It's not so simple. If there's a safe place on this earth left, it won't be long till those monsters find it and make it worse. I watched a puff of smoke from my cigarette plume off the glass window inches from my face. Who knows, huh? Maybe there's a good place. Maybe there's a place we go after life. Maybe that's the safe place. My best advice: don't hope for it. Make it. Make it safe in the place you know. Do it in Golgotha, and never leave those walls again. There's nothing for you out here. Her voice was small in the wake of mine. You sound bitter. I don't know how you could say that. That's why I left home. We thought there's gotta be a good place still left. Maybe a place by the ocean. I shuddered at the thought. The ocean. She nodded. I shook my head. Don't even try it. You've heard the stories of what it's like. Those are just stories to scare kids. I sighed. And I'm sure you thought the stories of these ruins was just to scare kids. I'm sure you thought you knew it all. I rubbed the cigarette dead against the window. Take a hint and stay home. We hole up like rats or we die like them. A thought crossed her expression before she could enunciate it. I remember your name, said the girl. It's Harkin or something. Harlan. Yeah, that's right. You're Mr. Harlan, I guess. I've seen you down in the town square sometimes. You like to start fights. Lady told me to stay away from you. Himph. Well, never would have thought you were such a crank. You are quite the pessimist. No, I'm an optometrist. I think you mean optimist. I don't. You're very dull and angry seeming. That's a lot of words coming from a rich girl I pulled out of a hole. The room was quiet before she changed the subject once more. Well, don't you want to know my name? Sure. The word was plain. I'm Gemma. A pleasure. A moment of silence. You are aware that your father's caused a fuss on the home front because of your adventure. She shook her head. He shut off the water. That's why I came to find you. He said he wouldn't relinquish the pipes till his daughter was home. You have caused quite the problem. I didn't know. Of course you didn't. The haves rarely think of how their actions might affect the have-nots. Well, okay, fine, but there's other places out west too. More than these ruins. More than Golgotha too. I heard from travelers and traders that there are whole other places with different ways of life. Why don't people go there? Why should my father have more say than another? I nodded. Sure, there's a place out west where they raise sheep, chickens, or goats. That's where the demons stalk worse than anywhere. And even further west, northwest to be precise, there's where the medicines and wizards hail, a city called Babylon. There's other places, but you wouldn't have the faintest idea of how to get there. If you did, you'd have no standing. You'd be no better than any peasant in those places. Golgotha's where your family is, where your station is distinguished. You'd be a fool to give it up. She remained quiet for only a moment, studying the lines on her palms. Surely there's better places than home. I've seen some. I shook my head. If you're looking for a better place, wait for death. At least the walls are tall, and the guns are big. We rested there at the waypoint for a handful of days. Fevers began to take her sometime throughout the night. It would be smart to get her home before it got worse. We set out just as the sun crested some unseen horizon, sending shadows long and darker. There were points when hugging the sides of pitch-black walls that it remained night even in day within the dead city. Gemma was slow, and I took note of her knees or elbows quivering due to whatever strain might be placed upon them with our traversal. I remained as calm as I could as we shifted through the morning chill, through hell, through the uncompromising screams of distant mutants or demons echoing off the walls. Every so often those howls would come, and Gemma might freeze where she was, and I could see that if only for a moment, her eyes shrank, her throat swallowed, and she looked small and scared. Then it would be as though she was totally unbothered, and she'd throw her shoulders back and continue following me. Are you winded yet? I asked after several hours of climbing old wreckage and pushing across rubble. No, her speech was gasped yet tempered. Not yet. I'm fine. Don't be stupid. I stopped, put up my hand, and motioned for her to take a seat on a nearby stone. We sat for a moment, and I passed her the water. A few of the last drops ran the length from the corner of her mouth to her earlobe, and I winced at the loss. I'm ready to go again. She moved to rise, and I put my hand on her shoulder, snatching the empty gourd from her. Don't act silly now. There's no reason with all the sun we've got. I hope to make it to Golgotha while there's still light, but that does not mean I intend on dragging your corpse with me. If you need to relax, relax. If there's nothing better in this world, then what's my corpse matter? Gemma cut her eyes at me and stood to move away from me. Woe is you. I felt anger rising. Let's go then, but if you fall out here, I'm done dragging your ass around. Don't. She shrugged. The traveling was slowed. I caught a strange glint off Gemma's eyes when sun shafts landed across her face. Are you feverish still? How warm are you feeling? The brief thought of touching her forehead graced my thoughts. She didn't answer and instead pushed on, and so I did the same, maintaining a healthy habit of checking that she was following behind every few seconds. Without another break, through heavy breathing and through sweat, We met the edges of the open field around Golgotha nearing early evening, and I saw the fortified walls cloaking the base of the city's structures far out. I came to a stop while Gemma attempted to continue walking. I snatched her by the wrist, stopping her. Her head lolled around to look at me, although I'm certain she didn't really see me, and she cut her eyes hard, yanking her hand free of mine. Don't touch me. I see home. It's home. You said it's important. We should go hide like rats. Her jabbering came from the mouth of someone protesting through the haze of a dream. No, I need to signal that we're coming. The men on the walls will see us through their scopes, but that doesn't mean a stray bullet won't find us. I removed the sheet of aluminum Boss Maron had given me days prior and unfolded it until the thing was large as parchment sheet. I waved the aluminum flag overhead and began walking forward, grabbing Gemma's hand again. She did not fight me and instead staggered along, her foot tips tracing lines in the dirt. Normally, I might have checked through binoculars that the men on the wall signed back, but keeping a hold of Gemma was more important in her delirious state. We've still got enough sun in the sky that they'll know it's us from the reflection. Just as the words left my mouth, darkness overcame the landscape and I felt cold, for it wasn't night that came, but a massive shadow. I felt the wind of something immense and pulled Gemma closer to me. Looking up into the air, there was the great winged beast, a thing I'd only seen once before and never so close to a human bastion. Its several clawed fists hung in front of its chest, forelegs muscled and prepared for snatching whatever unsuspecting prey it might find. The demon's great head was that of a serpent, and the wings which arched from its back gathered wind beneath their membranes. Each stroke it took overhead left a dust fog in front of us, and I could scarcely make out the innumerable writhing tendrils which danced off the creature's body. The distinguished sound of the wall's gunfire registered across the open land, and I felt Gemma fall into me. Leviathan circled against the angry sky, casting its tremendous shadow across us. Examining Gemma, I could see her fever had overtaken her, and she'd fallen unconscious. I told you, God Emmett, I'm not going to drag your ass across this field. Wake up. I shook the unconscious girl. Her eyelids flickered. Wake up, for Christ's sake. I slapped her hard and nothing, and I shook her some more and pleaded. Leviathan's scream shook the ground beneath us. I moved across the open field as quickly as my legs would allow. With the addition of Gemma's dead weight, I could pull on her limp arms only so long before I knelt before the shadow of the beast and hoisted her over my shoulders. I ran, top-heavy, and imagined my feet leaving solid ground. Loud bangs were the signature for muzzle flashes from the wall that I could scarcely see through the sweat in my eyes. There was no protest from Leviathan, not a care in response to the barrage of munitions. Artillery whistled through the air, and the ground shook once more while I staggered over my own weight to glance up at the beast as it took a broadside shot to its black torso, and although the wound it received seemed critical, it remained unfazed, while tar-colored flesh shed off the beast, plodding all around me. The warmth from the explosion kissed me like hot breath, while the smell of rotted chicken filled the air and Leviathan's blood rained over us as it adjusted itself in the sky. Dark blood ran granular and rough down my face, and maybe Gemma mumbled innocuous cries. Still I continued through the muck. Another artillery round struck the creature's left wing, leaving behind a smoldering hole in its thick membrane, sending it forward into a nosedive to the ground. Its trajectory arched overhead, till it slammed in an explosion of sand far to the left, and the sun beamed once more. Its cries were the thousands, if not more, souls it devoured, screeching not like a dragon, but a village of tormented folks removed from this world and placed in another. It was the screams of strangled ghosts. The wild tentacles dotting its body writhed, snatching out at open air like whips and as thick as metal cables. The wind off the beast stung as it sent up sand in my face. Like a mistaken dog, it shook its head and propelled itself far and away into a leap that shook the ground till it glided over the horizon toward a place unseen. I stood in the open field, certain I was dead. It was not until murmurs escaped Gemma's mouth that I took toward Golgotha again. The cheers of the men on the wall overtook the clacking of the main gate coming free. I fell through the doorway while some of the wallmen gathered around. The blood of Leviathan was already thickened in the sun, clinging off me with some of its meat stinking and steaming into my clothes. Take the girl home. I shouldered Gemma off me onto the ground, and she was caught by the men while I fell. People gathered round in knots of bewildered faces. Water. Some of them shouted as the spigots in town ran freely once more. Some cheered while I took tiredly in the square by the gate and sat on an arrangement of cinder blocks. Boss Meron was there, an old metal bucket banging against his left knee. He took the contents of the container and tossed it over my head. The water was warm but welcome. "You stink," said the boss. "Why don't you go shit somewhere else?" I was nauseous at the stench clinging to me. Shaking my right hand, a hunk of the creature sloughed off my arm onto the ground. Boss Meron took up alongside me. "Why don't we just play nice some? Hey, I don't want to hear it. What's happened to the girl you left with? You left with one girl and came back with another. What a heartbreaker you are." Certainly, a man about town. Depositing my pack between my knees, I removed tobacco and took to rolling a cigarette. The paper kept tearing in my hands. Boss Harold has a plan for those boys. Those ones that took him hostage. So I'm just glad you came back with the girl. Others are too. It's not like you went without water. A chuckle fell from him. Course not. There's no reason I should. But some of the veggies in the hydro lab looked thirsty. It's good you returned when you did. Anyway, we knew you'd come through. I can't remember a time you haven't. I bit a poorly folded cigarette and inhaled opposite a match. My eyes traced the people cheering in the streets out near the gate, then up to the wall where soldiers stood with their rifles. What brought the dragon out? Boss Meron wondered aloud. Who gives a shit? Why don't you go pull its tail and ask? Among the revelers stood a figure in a cloak with a hood covering stringy gray hair. Lady was there in a moment, watching my conversation from afar. Then she was swallowed by the crowd. Christmas Nightmare House. It was supposed to be a fun day visiting a Christmas village. Just the five of us, co-workers and the best of friends, out for a good time during the holidays. Maybe it would have been, but how were we supposed to know the festive house with all the lights and snow wasn't Santa's workshop? "Isn't this wonderful?" Clarissa, my wife, said as we entered the Christmas village. It really was. An open field just outside of town had been converted into a sprawling replica of the North Pole. The buildings were designed to look like quaint cottages and shops, complete with themes of toys and candy. Colored lights were draped everywhere, making the entire village sparkle and twinkle like a starburst of colors. Actors dressed up like Santa's helpers wandered about, playing roles, interacting with the customers, and hawking various souvenirs. There was even a petting zoo with reindeer and an actual sleigh with 9 reindeer hooked up, ready to take it on a tour through town for one of the scheduled candy parades. Finally, there was Santa himself, sitting on a throne atop a hill surrounded by decorated pine trees and brightly wrapped packages, greeting people and taking pictures with them. How then could such a wonderful place harbor something so terrible as that house? Most of the day was wonderful. It was crisp Saturday, and we had been planning this outing as a group all week. It was a pure delight being part of the fun as my wife and friends excitedly toured the village. We did everything there was to do that day. We shopped in every store. We snacked in every restaurant and food stand. We played every game. We drank every warm, seasonal boozy beverage there was. We pet the reindeer. We took pictures with Santa. We role-played with the actors and generally goofed off. It was a magical day. And then we found the workshop. "What's that?" Joel asked curiously, pointing down a narrow, unused side street. "Let's find out," Carol said, laughing and smiling. "Whatever it is, I bet it's fun." We all cheerily went along with her suggestion, singing Christmas carols as we made our tipsy way to the mystery place. What we saw when we got there was the most magical thing we had seen all day. They really went all out here, John exclaimed excitedly. I can hardly believe it. They even got real little people to play the elves. I looked again. Sure enough, all of the actors playing the elves were unusually short. There couldn't have been one of them over 4 feet tall. They were busily working, rushing about like they were preparing for something big. Unreal, I said, and noticed my breath fog in front of me. Clarissa hugged her arms around herself. It's cold here. Why don't we go inside Santa's workshop? I bet it's fun. The workshop looked exactly as one might imagine Santa's workshop to be. Red, white, green, silver, and gold were the colors. The architecture looked very 15th century, giving it a quaint appearance. There were snowmen, small pine trees, and big candy canes scattered around the grounds. A warm light glowed inside, gently filtering out of the windows, and a thick curl of white smoke rose from the chimney like a serpentine cloud. All of us were feeling the cold. The crisp air seemed to have taken a sudden plunge, and it only made the warm, festive building all the more appealing. We happily agreed that it looked like fun and walked to it. The elves mostly seemed not to notice us as they rushed about their work, but I noticed one give us a stern look and a shake of his head, and he rushed on by. Something about him seemed off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Hurry, John called as I paused to consider the strange behavior by this small man. I caught up as everyone reached the door. Joel opened it and held it open as we all filed in. Inside it was bright and warm. Not painfully bright like an office with too much overhead lighting, but comfortably bright, like an open field on an early spring day. It smelled of sugar and baked goods. The entry was an open room, festively decorated with a reception and a door that led inside. Behind the desk was a small man dressed as an elf. He smiled at us and waved us over. Before you enter the workshop, you need to sign the registry, he said in cheerful tone. What's inside? Carol asked curiously, eyeing the door behind the elf. The little man smiled widely. It's a place like no other, he said brightly, where the wonders never cease and everyone gets what they deserve. Well, I deserve $1 million, Joel said with a laugh. Let's sign this book and get on in there. We were all there for a good time. We'd been having a good time. So how could we possibly know? How could we have any reason to expect that by signing that guest book, our wonderful day would become the stuff of nightmares? We happily signed our pages on lines at the bottom of individual pages. Most of each page was covered in ornate calligraphy, so fancy that none of us could actually read it. At the bottom was a heavy line with an X in front of it, indicating that it was where we should sign. The paper felt like old vellum, and the pen was a proper fountain pen that ink flowed out of in a dark line that varied in thickness with every stroke. Something wasn't sitting quite right in my mind. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a general sense that all was not as it seemed. What's this say? I asked as I was signing my name. Standard release, the elf said in a tone that indicated it didn't matter. You know how these lawyers are, making everything into a liability. I laughed at this, as did my wife and John. Joel gave Clarissa a mock look of alarm, and she joined in the laughter. As soon as the last of us finished signing, the door opened, and we could see inside. The ladies gasped, and the men's eyes grew wide in wonder. I wish I had the words to properly describe what we saw as we looked through that door, but it was everything any of us could have thought, hoped, and expected Santa's workshop to be. It was filled with toys, elves busily crafting them as they chatted cheerfully, laughed, and sang. That's when I noticed what had seemed off to me before. Guys, I said hesitantly, these dwarfs are proportioned like a full-size person, just shorter. Good for them, John said dismissively. Now let's get in there and enjoy the best workshop setup I've ever seen. I didn't share my friend's lack of concern. Normally, a person with dwarfism is not proportional to a full-sized person. Their heads are large compared to their bodies. Their limbs are short compared to their bodies too. These actors were more like pygmies. People who do not suffer from dwarfism, but are still extraordinarily short. It's incredibly rare, and there was no way this seasonal fair should have been able to find so many. The elves and the rest of the village are full-sized people. These people are all pygmies, I said with concern / some things. In we go, my wife interrupted, and she pushed me through the door with everyone else following. At first, everything was fine. At first, everything was exactly as it had seemed from the other room. That is, until a new figure entered the room. Look, Carol squealed with excitement. It's Santa. And at first it seemed to be. In walked a large man dressed in an old-fashioned Santa outfit, green and brown, the kind he was best known for before the Coke Company popularized the red variant. He was a large man, with a thick, long white beard flowing out from under his hood. He carried a large sack over one shoulder, and in his other hand he held a shining scroll. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hood with only his beard, and the tip a long pointed nose poking out. "Welcome," he said in a deep, booming voice. "It is time to check your signatures against the list and see if you're naughty or nice." Everyone but me oohed and awed in delighted anticipation. It was the nose. His nose wasn't right. Wasn't Santa's nose supposed to be like a button, not long and thin? I shook my head to clear the thought away. "It's not the real Santa," I muttered under my breath. "Get over it." I convinced myself that it was just the actor. I couldn't expect every Santa actor to actually look perfectly like the mythical version of Saint Nick after all. It was a silly notion, an unreasonable expectation. And yet this didn't feel like the fun fakery of the village outside. And just why was the biggest, most effortful, most important part of the Christmas village tucked away from everything else, hidden down a narrow side street where anyone could miss it? Why wasn't it the literal center of town? These thoughts raged through my skull, and I wanted to voice them. But I tamped down the urge, telling myself that I was just being silly, that this strange paranoia was unfounded with no relation to reality. "Joel Donaldson," Santa announced in that booming voice. "Yours is the first name signed. Time to see if you're naughty or nice." Joel stepped forward with a comical flourish. I noticed that his face was radiant with a blend of happiness and just a little bit too much alcohol consumed in our day of revels. "I'm ready for my present," he announced with all the innocence and expectation of someone who truly thought that was right in the world. "You will get your just reward," Santa declared somberly. He held up the scroll in front of him and let it unfurl. He read it aloud. "Joel Donaldson, you are on the naughty list." "Ooh," Joel said mockingly with a smile and a wave of his hands. The elves all stopped working and began to gather around us. They sang "Naughty List, Naughty List, you are on the naughty list," over and over again as they surrounded Joel. Big, truly joyful smiles plastered across their smooth faces. Santa stepped aside, revealing a chair that had not been there before. "Come," he commanded. "Receive your reward." The elves crowded in around Joel and began pushing him forward toward the chair. "Naughty list, naughty list, you are on the naughty list," they continued to sing. Joel laughed and went along with it, believing that nothing was out of place, and it was all just part of the show. He walked past Santa and plopped himself down in the chair. That was the moment when the truth of our situation revealed itself. Heavy spiked leather straps erupted out of the chair and wrapped themselves around Joel, trapping him and pining him down. They squeezed and tightened around his legs and torso, and pinpricks of blood began to stain his clothing in slowly spreading circles of red. He screamed in surprise and pain. "What are you doing to me?" he yelled, pain cracking his voice as he thrashed his head and swatted futilely at the straps binding him to the chair. The elves laughed musically and began to chant, "Naughty list, naughty list," the tone becoming increasingly menacing with every syllable. The floor opened up in front of Joel, and a large ornate office desk stacked with papers and writing implements rose up before him. The elves' chanting ceased as Santa began to speak. Joel Donaldson, he announced in a tone was both businesslike and filled with malice. You have been a naughty boy. You have been stealing from your employer, using your position as accountant to cook the books and move money from the business to your personal accounts. I've done no such thing, Joel insisted. Let me out of here. I swear to God, I'm going to sue you into oblivion. The rest of us were too stunned to say or do anything. What could we do? This was supposed to be a fun day. It was supposed to be safe and innocent. Just 5 friends from work having a good time at the fair. We couldn't properly process this sudden turn of events, and we stood transfixed in horror as the scene unfolded before us. Santa laughed at Joel's futile threat. There was no merriment in it. It was a deep belly laugh, but it was filled with such malice that I hesitate to call it a laugh at all, but there is no better word to describe it. The straps tightened and moved, scraping across Joel like a sandpaper belt, shredding his clothing and the skin beneath. He thrashed and screamed in pain, and blood began to flow more freely. An elf walked up and placed an old quill pen in Joel's right hand before sliding a leather-bound ledger across the desk in front of him. Joel protested and dropped the pen. The straps tightened and raked him some more in response to his defiance before the elf picked up the pen and put it back in his hand. Your punishment is to find the errors and correct the balances in these books, Santa said with finality. Every one of them is the result of a dishonest man lying and abusing his position to steal, just like you. I know you're accustomed to different tools for your trade, but I'm afraid that you'll just have to complete this task the old-fashioned way. And if I refuse, Joel said through teeth gritted in pain. The straps raked him again, and he screamed. Santa chuckled evilly. If you refuse, the straps will punish you. If you make a mistake, the straps will punish you. If you fall asleep, the straps will punish you. Make enough mistakes, and the straps won't stop. They will drag across your body and tighten until they have cut you to ribbons. No, Joel screeched as the chair slammed forward so hard that he would have slammed his head into it if his toes had not been tightly strapped to the chair, pinning him against the desk. Naughty list. Naughty list. The elves sang again. You are on the naughty list. I watched as Joel reached forward with a shaking hand and took hold of a paper sitting atop one of the large piles. When he pulled his hand back, a bunch of the papers fell to the desk, and the straps on the chair reacted, slicing across his body like a belt sander. Santa's booming laugh drowned out my friend's screams as the door to the next room opened. The 4 of us who were still free to move screamed in unison and ran back to the door we came in through, desperately trying to escape this nightmare version of Santa's workshop. It was sealed shut, refusing to open no matter how hard we pulled, pushed, or battered against it. The only response to our screams for help was the laughter of Santa, accompanied by the joyful singing of the elves as they continued their refrain of condemnation. You must go forward, Santa commanded. Go forward and receive your just reward. We continued our futile attempt at escape a while longer, but stopped when the elves crowded around us and began to push us to the open doorway to the next room. Just reward. Just reward, they chanted. Joel screamed again as the wicked chair responded to some error he made, and I knew then that he was never meant to survive the task set before him, but to be slowly killed as he desperately tried to complete an impossible task. The 4 of us tumbled through the door and into the next room to the sound of booming laughter over chants of just reward. The doors slammed shut behind us as the lights came on, bathing us in a gentle glow while we desperately pounded at the closed door, screaming to be let out. The sound of many people talking stopped us, and we turned around in morbid curiosity to see what was going on. The room was filled with people stuffed into old-fashioned telephone booths. They were babbling nonsense into the receivers with pained looks on their faces. Once in a while, one of them would drop the phone in a coughing fit and spit up a great gout of blood before picking the receiver up again and babbling some more. A column of elves filed into the room from a hidden door. Wicked smiles plastered across their faces They went about the room checking the phone booths, performing repairs, and washing out blood by connecting a hose to a nozzle on the outside of the phone booth that caused the water to spray right into the person's face at high volume, rinsing away the blood by sheer volume of water that drained out the bottom to God knows where. Booming laughter announced the arrival of Santa Claus as he approached us from behind the phone booths. "Carol Jenkins," he announced. "Time to see if you've been naughty or nice." He raised the hand with the scroll, but before he let it unfurl, I called out. "Wait," I pleaded. "What kind of Santa's workshop is this? Santa doesn't hurt people. The worst he does is give coal naughty children." Looking back, I know it was a pointless question. Silly even. Our captors were going to do what they intended with or without explanation. What did it matter if the man before us wasn't actually Santa Claus? Why would it matter anyway? This was supposed to be a fair with nothing but human actors. Humans don't follow Saint Nick rules. Only the truth was even worse than any of us imagined. The man dressed as Santa laughed. Not his usual booming laugh, but a low, menacing laugh. "Santa Claus." He chuckled. "What makes you think I'm Santa Claus? Is it the robe?" He stood to his full height then, and he towered above us all. He pulled back his hood and grinned like a jack-o'-lantern. "Behold," he commanded in his booming voice, "I am Krampus, and I punish the wicked." We all stared in horror at the giant before us. His face was like gnarled wood, old and weathered, with hollow features, a long pointy nose, and deep, sharp eyes that seemed to look right through us. He dropped his bag and removed his gloves, revealing gnarled, knobby hands tipped with claw-like nails. The bag opened when it fell, revealing its contents to be nothing but stout reeds and human bones. "I am not here to reward the nice list," he continued. "I bear only the naughty list. If your name is on it, you will be properly rewarded for your behavior. It will be your just reward, and justice is harsh." Carol's eyes opened wide, and her mouth worked rapidly, trying to speak, but failing to form any words. Krampus again lifted the scroll and let it unfurl. "Carol Jenkins," he announced, "you are on the naughty list." As he announced this, the elves in the room began to sing. "Naughty list, naughty list, you are on the naughty list." They surged around her and pushed and carried her to Krampus as she screamed in terror. "You are a gossip," Krampus declared. "You spread rumors and falsehoods about others without regard for the harm you're doing. You destroy people's names, reputations, and relationships with your wicked tongue." She struggled against the elves to no avail. As soon as she was close enough, Krampus reached out and snatched her up with one great, gnarled hand and pulled her in close. "As punishment, you must confess the truth to every one of your victims," he said in a threatening tone. The floor next to them opened, and a new phone booth rose up. "Naughty list, naughty list," the elves chanted. "But you won't be using that lying tongue," he continued. "A tool of deceit has no place in honest confession." Carol struggled in his grasp and started to scream for help, but Krampus shot his free hand forward and shoved his fingers into her open mouth. Her mouth was forced open wider than it could naturally go, and her mouth tore open into a wide, jagged smile, and Krampus closed his fingers around her tongue. With a swift yank, he ripped her tongue out. Blood sprayed out of her mouth as she screamed in agony. Krampus dropped her tongue and held out his hand. A smiling elf ran forward and placed a small candy cane in it. He took the piece of candy and shoved it into Carol's mouth. The bleeding stopped instantly. It was no mercy, though, as Krampus immediately threw her into the phone booth and closed the door. "Call them," he commanded. "Once you confess your slander to all of your victims, you're free to go." Carol beat on the door, desperately trying to break free. It was pointless. She was as trapped as the rest of the people in that room. A door opened at the far end of the room. "Go," Krampus commanded, "and receive your just reward." The elves began to crowd around us again. They pushed and prodded us in the direction of the door. We reluctantly went. My wife broke down crying. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed in great, shuddering gasps. John yelled in protest about how they couldn't do this to us. I was silent. None of it mattered anyway. We were trapped, well and truly, and no amount of protest, no flood of tears would change it. We neared the door and were roughly shoved the last few steps. The door slammed shut as soon as we were through, leaving us enveloped in darkness. We waited in silence for a few moments. The darkness was oppressive, and my anxiety climbed with every second. It could be hiding literally anything, and based on the horrors of the last two rooms, that anything was certain to be deeply disturbing at best and outright horrifying at worst. Hello. I called out to the darkness in a shuddering breath. As if in response, there was a slow grinding sound as part of the wall dropped down, revealing a roaring fireplace. The inferno lit the room in a dancing, ominous glow. It might have been a comforting glow under other circumstances, but after the previous two rooms, there was nothing it could be but a sign of foreboding. In the center of a room was a large wrought iron framed bed with chains at the head and foot. In place of a mattress was an iron slab. Beyond that, the room lay barren, empty of all signs of life or habitation. The fire blazed even higher and belched out into the room, licking the bed frame for just a moment like the tongue of some arcane, hungry beast. As the fire retreated, a now familiar, horrifying figure stepped out of the flames, followed by an entourage of those despicable elves. Without any further fanfare, Krampus held out his scroll and dropped the bottom roll. John Valentine, he announced in that booming voice. You are on the naughty list. The elves were on him in an instant, singing that horrible chant. Naughty list. Naughty list. You are on the naughty list. As they grabbed him and lifted him overhead, kicking and screaming. It was futile. Small as they were, the elves' grip was like iron, and all John could accomplish was wrenching his own back and shoulders painfully as they proceeded to the bed. The elves chained him to the bed, iron manacles locked tight around his wrists and ankles. Then they pulled the chains taut to splay him out and immobilize him. He screamed in pain and terror as his shoulders and hips were dislocated with a series of loud pops. You are guilty of adultery, many, many times, Krampus announced with malicious glee. You lied to cover it up. You betrayed someone close to you, exploited his trust, and smiled as you deceived a friend. John was screaming in protest. It's not like that. He protested. We're in love. You can't blame me for being in love. Love is a beautiful thing. Krampus laughed wickedly. You continue to lie even as you face just punishment for your crimes, he declared with absolute authority. You never loved her. You had other women even as you took what didn't belong to you over and over and over again. I was stunned. The John I knew would never do something so heinous. He was a good, upright man, and the only one I trusted completely. I turned to my wife in shock. Who did he? My words caught in my throat as I saw my wife, my dear Clarissa, crying, her mouth quivering with great sobs, and tears flowing like twin rivers from her bright green eyes. Her head hung in shame. He said he loved me, she sobbed. He promised that he would make everything better and all of my problems would go away if I chose to be with him, she sobbed. She looked at me with profound sadness and regret. It was me, she confessed. I'm so sorry, it was me. The happiness I felt in our marriage wasn't there anymore, and he promised to make me happy again. Her words hit me like a bullet to the heart. My wife and my best friend, the two people in the world dearest to me, who I trusted with my life, betrayed me. Together, I felt my own tears begin to well up and pour out of my eyes. Why? I croaked, unable to think of anything else to say. I still love you, she said with sincerity. I always loved you. That never changed. But the magic was gone. I stopped being happy at the thought of you. The sweet things you do lost their magic and became routine. I wanted that happiness back. I craved the intensity of it. and he gave it to me. That's all." Her words were like a punch to the gut by a champion heavyweight boxer. I was left stunned, breathless, and unable to form a coherent thought. "Clarissa Hart," Krampus announced as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to speak. "You are on the naughty list." The elves crowded around my wife. "Naughty list. Naughty list. You are on the naughty list." They chanted gleefully as they grabbed her, lifted her up, and began to march toward the bed. "No," I screamed. "I forgive her. I don't care what she did. We'll work it out. We'll find our happiness again. Don't take her from me. I love her." The only response I got to my pleas was a continued chant of naughty list. Naughty list. You are on the naughty list. As those demonic elves joyfully carried my wife, kicking and screaming apologies and professions of her love for me to the iron bed. "You also are guilty of adultery, lying, and betrayal of the one person who loved and trusted you above all others," he declared. "Your crimes were committed with the condemned man. Therefore you will share his fate just as you shared your own marriage bed with him." The elves shackled and stretched her exactly as they had to John. I turned away as she screamed in pain and terror, every pop of her joints sending a shudder of sorrow and regret through my body. "You must witness this," Krampus said to me in an almost sympathetic voice. "She would have left you anyway, only to get her heart broken in betrayal. She cared far less for you than she did for her own selfish desires." I turned back to face the bed and lifted my head. All I could see through the haze of tears was blurry vision of a black lump of iron with 2 patches of color on top. I heard the sound of metal grating and sliding as floor plates moved, opening a blazing pathway from the fireplace to the bed one panel at a time. My wife and my best friend screamed even louder and began to thrash, desperation overriding the pain in their dislocated limbs as they realized what was going to happen. Over it all, I could hear the booming sound of Krampus' voice as he declared, "Your bodies will burn together just as you burned with lust together." The elves surrounded me and carried me bodily across the room to a newly opened door. They dumped me through it, and it slid shut just as I heard the screams of the 2 people I loved best intensify as the flames reached the underside of the bed and began to heat the iron slab they lay upon. I lay in a crumpled head for I don't know how long, sobbing with intense sorrow at all that I lost. My friends, my wife, all gone, victims of a demonic entity meting out a twisted and final justice that nothing in me could reconcile as right or proper. We all fall short. We all make mistakes. None of us is truly innocent in this world. It's only a matter of degree and amount. Eventually, I opened my eyes, stood up, and looked around. I was in a cozy sitting room. There was a perfectly ordinary fireplace with a non-threatening fur cheerily popping away. There was a table set with a fine feast. There was a long, overstuffed couch. The room was festively decorated with all the trimmings of a proper Christmas celebration. And in a very large chair sat the demon Krampus, patiently waiting for me to notice him. "Take a seat," he said gently, motioning to the couch with one large bony hand. Seeing no other course of action, I obeyed. "You are not on the naughty list," he declared with a soft authority, the wickedly mirthful booming voice somehow absent. "What?" I replied dumbly, my mind not comprehending what I had just heard after seeing my wife and friends sentenced to torment and death. "You're not fully innocent," Krampus explained, "but minor infractions do not condemn a man, therefore, you are not on the naughty list." I sat there in stunned silence, expecting it to be some sort of malicious joke at my expense. I expected those horrible elves to show and start chanting about me being on the naughty list as they dragged me off to be tortured and killed. It didn't happen. "Why?" I croaked after I finally found my voice. "You think me a demon," Krampus stated. "That's understandable, but I'm not." "I don't understand," I said in soft confusion. Krampus nodded his head. "And you never truly will," he replied. "All you need to know is that I am tasked with rewarding people for the evil acts they commit. Not evil by any human understanding, but according to a universal truth that many deny even exists. What even is that? I asked softly. The universe operates under certain rules, Krampus explained. Good and evil exist because of those rules. Good is whatever follows the rules, and evil is whatever breaks them. The catch is that your kind is bound to break them. The only question is which rules you break, and how often. I don't know why, but something about being told that good and evil are universal and unchanging, that humanity has no say in the matter, incensed me. That doesn't give you the right to just murder people. I shouted, all of my pain, sadness, and rage coming out in a single exhausting burst. I slumped back in my chair, completely spent, suddenly helpless, and uncaring. Just kill me and get it over with, I sighed. Stop toying with me. Krampus chuckled. A real one, like he genuinely found me funny / I'm not going to kill you, he declared with finality. You're not on the naughty list. Instead, I'm going to give you a gift. I didn't have time to ask what he meant by gift before he was on me. He grabbed a hold of the front of my shirt with one mighty hand and lifted me up. Then with his free hand, he pulled back his hood to reveal that among his other horrifying features, he had horns like a goat, and this straggly hair that seemed to flow and move of its own volition. He opened his mouth, and it stretched wider than any mortal man's mouth ever could, so wide that I thought he meant to eat me in a single gulp. Then he breathed. He breathed on me, a deep sighing breath that seemed to have no end. I reeked of carrion rot smothered with mint and cloves. I tried to hold my breath to avoid breathing the foul fumes, but it wasn't long before I found myself taking in a great gasp of air as my body overrode my mind and forced me to breathe whether I wanted to or not. At first, I felt nothing other than simple revulsion. I gagged on the foul breath and coughed like my lungs wanted to jump out my mouth. Then it subsided, and I found myself inhaling. I inhaled like never before, seeming to have no limit to how much air I could take in. I inhaled until every last foul fume that Krampus emitted was sucked in, and then he dropped me to the floor. I lay there coughing and sputtering as though my body were now rejecting the clean air now that Krampus had finished fumigating me. Krampus stood looming over me like the specter of death himself until I settled down and stood again on my own 2 feet. I looked up and saw his hood drawn far forward yet again, like it had been when I first laid eyes upon him. His eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. He said nothing, waiting as if in expectation. What now? I asked, coughing as I spoke. A door that I had not noticed before opened up to reveal a familiar, snowy landscape. Now you go out into the world and see it for what it truly is, he said in a voice that grew deeper and more foreboding with every word. That is your gift. You will always know the truth about the people you meet. Never again will you be deceived. I started to speak up, to ask what he meant by his statement, but he hushed me and pointed to the door. Go, he commanded in that booming voice I had come to know and dread. Leave my workshop and never return. I turned and walked out the door and into the Christmas village. All was as it had been before we found and entered that wicked workshop. People were blissfully enjoying the fair in the cold winter air, a recent layer of snow coating the land with a cozy frozen blanket. I turned around, and the workshop was gone. Where it once stood was a town center filled with bustling shops and Christmas-themed carnival games. A drink vendor was off to one calling out for people to come and enjoy hot spiced mead and mulled wine to warm their bodies on a cold winter day. I needed a drink, and I hurried over to the vendor, fully intending to order a hot mug of mulled wine, when I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. I did a double take, looking at the man in stunned disbelief. I couldn't properly explain it, but as plainly as though it was written all over his face, I knew things about the man that I had no logical way to know. I knew beyond all doubt that this was a con man. I knew that he served cheap drinks that he labeled as expensive premium ones. I knew that he was a habitual liar who lacked an honest bone in his body. I knew that he sweet-talked many a gullible young woman into his bed for his own amusement with false promises and declaration of affection before moving on to a new town where he did it all again. I knew that he had murdered his own mother and made it look like a falling accident so he could collect her life insurance before the term expired. I knew about the vial of oleander toxin he kept hidden in his inside coat pocket so he could poison the occasional drunk, knowing it would look like a heart attack, and the coroner was unlikely to look any deeper. "What can I get for you?" the man said cheerily. A wide smile splayed across his face. "Do you have anything stronger than wine?" I asked, suddenly wanting nothing to do with anything this man touched. He pointed behind me to a small building simply marked bar. "Go there if you want liquor," he said with the same cheer and smile he'd originally had. I thanked him and left, heading to the bar at first, then turning down the street and leaving, wanting nothing more than to put as much distance between myself and a Christmas village as humanly possible.